In the darkness of the Shiloh temple, a boy lay beside the Ark of the
Samuel!
Covenant. Suddenly, a terrifying voice called out, "Samuel, Samuel."
Samuel!
The boy's heart pounded. The heavens, silent for centuries, shattered the night. A horrifying prophecy was given to the child. The entire priestly lineage would be annihilated on a single day. From Hannah's infertility, from the most horrific vow of sacrifice in history, a boy was born to end the bloody judgment age and usher in a new era of kings. Samuel, the one heard by God, was the last bridge between chaos and kingdom, and his story had only just begun.
Have you ever felt the terror of total societal collapse? Walk with me into the era of the judges. Israel is fracturing, no king. Everyone simply does whatever feels right. I watch my people abandon God, drown in the bitter consequences, and scream out for mercy. Then, heaven intervenes, raising up a judge to temporarily save us. It is a suffocating, endless loop of sin and exile. But within this dark historical moment, a child is destined to be born, the final judge, the greatest prophet since Moses. His name will be Samuel, meaning heard by God or asked of God. But this biblical story truly starts in my agonizing emptiness. I am Hannah aching for a child. Through my crushing psychological pain and stubborn faith, Samuel would eventually enter this world. A living answer to a broken woman's desperate, sacred vow to her creator. My boy's life will rewrite Israel's ancient history, shifting our wandering, fearful nation from the chaotic era of judges into the rigid dawn of kings. Deep in Ephraim's shadows lives Elkanah, my husband. Like many men of this era, he has two wives. I am Hannah, the other is Peninnah. My daily life is a psychological torment. Peninnah parades her many children while my arms remain empty. The ancient text states it brutally, Elkanah has two wives. Yes, Peninnah is a mother, and I am barren. In our ancient society, this isn't just bad luck. It is a suffocating, deeply crushing spiritual shame. Neighbors whisper that I am cursed by heaven. My profound sorrow stems not just from my agonizing hunger to be a mother, but from Peninnah's relentless, daily cruelty. Each year, I am forced to travel with them to Shiloh to offer sacrifices to God. Shiloh should be a spiritual sanctuary, but it is my personal hell. My rival twists the knife, mocking me because God closed my womb. An endless cycle of yearly torture. Whenever I enter the Lord's house, her taunts break me until I cannot eat. You and I both know this kind of psychological torment. It completely paralyses the soul. Year after bleeding year, the exact same ridicule, the familiar agonizing humiliation. Peninnah never misses an opportunity to remind me of my crushing lack of identity. Every new baby she bears feels like a physical blow against my worth. My husband, Elkanah, witnesses my dark despair and tries to offer comfort. Elkanah pleads with me, Hannah, why are you crying? Why starve yourself? Why this dark depression? Am I not better to you than 10 sons? Elkanah genuinely loves me. He gives me a double portion at the altar to prove I am cherished. Yet, a husband's affection cannot cure this cavernous, spiritual emptiness inside me. I am starving for the identity of motherhood, to hold my own baby. At the Shiloh festival, surrounded by joyful feasting, my throat just closes. Hot tears stream down my face. The psychological weight in my chest chokes me. This trauma steals every simple joy from my weary existence. Every single year, the exact same story. Silent crying, venomous words, and my hollow soul. Yet beneath this misery, something fiercely awakens. A desperate, unyielding faith. I absolutely refuse to accept that God cannot rewrite my tragic story. During one of those wretched Shiloh trips, my mind finally shatters. While the family drunkenly celebrates the meal, I slip away into the dark sanctuary to pray. The emotional exile is too crushing. I have to pour this agony out. Once the feasting ends, I stagger to my feet. Eli the priest sits nearby, watching the temple doors. I ignore him. Drowning in profound grief, I scream out to the Lord, sobbing uncontrollably. I refuse to quietly rot in this depression anymore. I drag my trauma directly to God. Violent tears fall as my broken soul spills out. This isn't some polite religious ritual. It is the primitive scream of a dying identity. In the shadows, I make a terrifying, sacred vow. I swear it aloud. Lord Almighty, if you will just see my crushing misery, remember me, pull me from this forgotten exile, and give me a son. Then I will surrender him to you for his entire life. No razor will touch his head. My vow exposes my total surrender. This isn't about defeating Peninnah or societal shame anymore. I am fully prepared to hand back the exact blessing I am dying for. If given a son, he becomes a Nazirite, wholly consumed by divine service, marked forever by uncut hair. But as I plead, the atmosphere suddenly shifts. Eli the priest is staring at me. As I aggressively wrestle with God, he watches my mouth. I'm screaming internally, lips trembling wildly but producing zero sound. Eli assumes I am wasted. My emotional trauma is so paralyzing, my lips just vibrate in absolute silence. To him, my spiritual war looks like cheap intoxication. Picture me there, sobbing, violently shaking, soundless. The old priest completely misreads my shattered psyche. "How long will you stay drunk? Put away your wine," he snaps. The humiliation is suffocating. I am bleeding spiritually, yet judged a sinner. I find my voice clinging to my dignity. "No, my lord," I whisper, "I am profoundly troubled. I haven't touched wine or beer. I am merely pouring out my tormented soul to God. Please do not view me as some wicked outcast." I speak only from the depths of sheer anguish and psychological grief. Realizing his error, Eli's demeanor shatters. The harsh judgment transforms into a sudden, unexpected blessing. "Go in peace. May Israel's God grant your petition." Those words spark a violent, beautiful hope inside me. God himself is speaking through the priest. I whisper, "May I find favor." Then I leave, finally able to eat. The shadow breaks. I walk out radically transformed. Pure hope has finally conquered my agonizing despair. I don't know if a baby is coming, but my sadness vanishes. My face glows. My hunger for life simply returns. Absolute trust anchors my heart before the miracle even manifests. At dawn, we rise, worshiping the Lord once more before journeying back toward Ramah. The ancient world resumes its chaos, but inside my body something shifts. I carry an unshakable hope. The sacred text records my turning point quietly. We rise early, bow to the heavens, and make the dusty trek home to Ramah. Elkanah embraces me and the Creator remembers. "See, you and I are never forgotten. From my darkest exile, a son is finally born." I named him Samuel because I begged the Creator for him. After years of crushing silence and sorrow, I was finally pregnant. You and I know what that dark waiting feels like. The tears that once fell from bitter grief now flowed from pure relief. Every tiny flutter inside my womb reminded me of the profound miracle waking up within me. During those quiet months of carrying him, I prepared every little detail obsessively. I sewed his tiny clothes in the candlelight. I whispered to him in the dark, telling him ancient stories of the God who finally heard my cries. But I was haunted. I knew this child was never truly mine alone. He was sworn to the unseen for his entire breathing life. Then the terrifying, beautiful day finally arrived. I gave birth to a strong, healthy son. Staring into his tiny, fragile face, I gave him a name carrying centuries of weight. Samuel. In the ancient tongue, it means heard by God or asked of the divine. Every single time I spoke his name aloud, I relived that desperate answered prayer. His name was not just some beautiful tradition pulled from our old family tree. It was breathing proof of my survival, my faith, and divine loyalty. I asked the Maker for him, I whispered. It was just that simple. My whole existence of shame, silent tears, and sudden miracles was anchored in my boy's name. My husband Elkanah was absolutely overwhelmed with joy the moment his son drew breath. Our whole household celebrated his arrival, knowing he was a rare, sacred gift. Even Peninnah, who used to torment my empty womb, was forced to witness divine grace falling on my broken life. My boy grew strong and bright. I poured every ounce of my shattered, healed soul into him. I nursed him, held him through the dark nights, and guided his first fragile steps of faith. Those fleeting days were incredibly holy to me. I could hear the ticking clock. I knew they would not last forever. One day, my terrifying vow would demand payment. When the season arrived for the yearly trek to Shiloh, Elkanah packed up the animals and our entire household. Just like always, but this time I could not bear it. I stayed behind. While my husband led everyone up the mountain to offer blood and fulfill old debts, I hid away. I told my husband that once he stopped nursing, I would walk him up to the Maker myself, and he would stay in that holy place forever. I was desperate to stretch out every single second I had left. The brutal moment of exile was closing in, when I would abandon him to the cold stones of the tabernacle. He respected my dread. He told me to do what felt right and stay until he was weaned. He only prayed the divine would keep his end of the bargain. So my little boy stayed safe indoors with me, missing the yearly sacrifice. I swallowed every moment like it was water in a desert. I was desperately molding not just his fragile bones, but his spiritual spine for the terrifying purpose awaiting him. The years slipped like sand, and soon my boy was fully weaned. In our ancient world, we kept them close, nursing our young for up to 3 long years. I had drained every drop of joy from that borrowed time. Now the terrifying debt was due. My chest was ripped apart by agonizing loss and terrified faith. I packed our bags for the long walk to Shiloh. The nursing days were finally over. I led my tiny, innocent child up the road, dragging a 3-year-old bull, heavy sacks of crushed grain, and a skin of dark wine, straight to the holy house at Shiloh. When the bull's blood hit the altar, we shoved my boy toward Eli. Put yourself in my shoes, a mother handing over her own flesh with generous, bloody offerings. The massive bull, the mountain of fine flour, the heavy wine skins. I paid a ransom to prove the depth of my broken gratitude. This was no forced religious tax. It was a weeping, terrifying surrender of my identity. Standing before the old priest, my voice shook with raw agony. I begged his pardon. I told him that as surely as he breathed, I was the desperate ghost who stood right there years ago, silently weeping. I bled my soul out for this child, I explained, and the unseen God answered. So now I surrendered him back. He belonged to the altar forever. You and I have to visualize this terrible scene. My eyes were drowning in tears as I handed over my only boy. Samuel was so tiny, totally puzzled, yet feeling the crushing, sacred weight of my love. The old man stared, finally recognizing the madwoman who once collapsed here in silent anguish. Tearing my son from my arms was like cutting off my own flesh. He was my impossible miracle, my oxygen, my entire identity. But I knew the boy belonged to the infinite first. I tried convincing myself I wasn't losing him. I was just returning the grace I had begged to borrow. Eli took his small hand with deep solemnity, sensing the terrifying cost of my ancient vow. My boy would grow up in the shadows of the holy tent. It was a crushing burden, yet a magnificent honor to mold a mind utterly abandoned to the divine path. For my boy, this was absolute psychological exile, ripped from my warm embrace. Trading the careless laughter of normal childhood for the cold, rigid isolation of tabernacle life. He traded toys for rituals, yet the ancient scroll says we worship the Lord right there. Even barely walking, my child felt the terrifying hum of something unseen. That simple historic sentence carries all the massive weight. The text says we worshipped. Right inside that nightmare of maternal separation, I found transcendence. Elkanah, my tiny boy, and I collapsed into the dust, kneeling to the infinite. It was a terrifying, holy moment where absolute gratitude finally conquered my sorrow. Walking away from that temple was the most violent psychological tear I ever endured. Trekking back down the mountain with empty arms felt like bleeding to death, yet I felt peace. I knew my blood was anchored right where the Maker needed him. Even as the loneliness ate at me, my soul flooded with violent, unshakable thanks. Before I turned my back on the altar, I screamed out a prayer so heavy that they etched it into the biblical record forever. I refused to sing a funeral dirge for my living boy. I shouted a battle cry to the force that rewires human destiny. You and I hear it. I sang my joy aloud. My strength is raised high in the divine. I laugh in the face of my tormentors, completely addicted to your rescue. There is absolutely nothing sacred like our God. There is no other firm ground to stand on. Notice how I stopped talking about the boy entirely. My son's existence was never just a cure for my personal shame. It was the spark for a massive spiritual shift. My joy wasn't about being a mother anymore. It was about surviving the fire and finding who I truly was. Have you ever felt crushed by the world? You and I have that in common. My mother's song continues. Do not speak with arrogance, for God weighs every deed. She sang how the bows of mighty warriors shatter, while we who stumble find sudden strength. The full now beg for scraps, while the starving feast. The barren woman bears 7 children, while the mother of many slowly fades away. These words show how my mother, Anna, watched God rewrite the impossible. The powerful crack and the broken rise. The wealthy starve while the poor eat. The empty womb bursts with life, while the fruitful withers. Anna herself was walking proof of this terrifying, beautiful, transforming power. She warned them, "The Lord brings death and life. He drags us to the grave and pulls us back. He sends both poverty and wealth. He crushes and he elevates. He drags the poor from the dirt, pulling the broken from the ash heap. He seats us with princes, handing us thrones of honor, for the earth's foundations are his. Upon them he built the world. You and I must grasp the spiritual gravity here. Anna knew God holds absolute power over everything. Life, death, nothingness, and fortune. He owns the earth's deep roots. The Creator sustains reality with his breath. Her ancient song ended with a terrifying vision of the future. He will guard the footsteps of his faithful, but the wicked will be completely silenced in absolute darkness. Brute force wins nothing. Those fighting the Lord will shatter. The Most High will thunder from the heavens, judging the furthest edges of the earth. He will give terrifying strength to his king, exalting his anointed. These closing words haunted me, because Israel didn't even have a king back then. Looking back, Anna was speaking like a prophet. She was foretelling my own terrifying burden, the day I would be forced to anoint Israel's first king. Her song wasn't just a mother's relief. It was a terrifying glimpse into God's mind, a map of his dangerous, beautiful plans. Centuries later, they say Mary, the mother of Jesus, sang a very similar song, a mirror of my mother's ancient prophetic cry. Both women praised a God who shatters the proud and does the absolute impossible. But after pouring out her heart, she walked away to Ramah, leaving me, young Samuel, with Eli in the tabernacle's shadows. Despite the pain, she found peace, knowing I was fulfilling my terrifying destiny. While my mother traveled home, I remained behind in the sacred, suffocating silence of Shiloh. Just a boy isolated, learning to serve a holy God. My father left, and I was abandoned to minister under Eli. Can you imagine my absolute terror? Everything was alien, cold. This tabernacle wasn't home. It was a heavy labyrinth of blood, ancient rituals, and crushing responsibilities. The bronze altar reeking of sacrifice. The holy place with the bread of presence, the flickering golden lampstand, and the thick smoke of the incense. And beyond the veil, the most holy place, the Ark of the Covenant, a room I couldn't enter because I wasn't born a priest. Only Aaron's bloodline, the tribe of Levi, could step into that presence. I was just an Ephraimite. So I worked the edges, handling the heavy external duties. The grueling tasks Eli laid on my shoulders. Despite my youth, the weight was immense. Hauling offerings, scrubbing blood, preparing the space for worship. I organized what people brought, keeping the chaos at bay. The ancient texts simply say I ministered before the Lord, but it was a lonely survival. But there was one piece of my identity I desperately clung to, my clothes. Though just a lost boy, ministered in a linen ephod. Every single year, my mother stitched a little robe and brought it for the annual sacrifice. That linen garment was for priests. Wearing it was my armor. It proved that despite my bloodline, I was dedicated to serving God. It was a heavy, visible mark of my exile, but her care kept me breathing. She left me in the dark, but she never erased me. Every year, she carried up a brand new robe. As my body grew, my armor grew with it, a perfect fit for a lonely boy. That simple thread of motherly love became my anchor. It told me that even in this dark isolation, I was seen. I was deeply cherished. Those brief, yearly visits were my only light. She watched me learn the sacred rites, while I soaked in the rare, desperate warmth of my family's love. Eli would watch us, this fractured family, and speak a blessing over my parents, saying, "May the Lord give you more children to replace the boy you surrendered." Then they would leave me again, and God did bless her. She had 5 more children. While they lived their lives, I grew up in the crushing, holy presence of God. It was the beautiful, painful reward for her intense faith. After agonizing years of barrenness, after leaving me, her firstborn, at the altar she gained a full house. And I, the boy who felt like an orphan, now had brothers and sisters I barely knew, seeing them just once a year. The scripture coldly notes, The boy Samuel grew up in the Lord's presence. Growing up in his presence wasn't just physical. It meant absorbing ancient wisdom, deciphering God's cryptic ways, and memorizing bloody rituals and forgotten texts. I wasn't just surviving, my soul was expanding in the dark. That lonely childhood was the brutal forge preparing me for my impossible destiny. In those shadows, under Eli's fading eyes, I learned the mechanics of sacrifice, the weight of the law, and how to tune my ear to God's silent voice. I was just a kid being forged into a prophet. Yet, while I sought God, absolute darkness was taking over right in front of my own eyes. Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas, the official priests of the sacred tabernacle. They were poisoning the temple with their sickening corruption. The ancient text is blunt. Eli's sons were monsters. They cared absolutely nothing for the Lord. That one sentence hides a terrifying reality. They wore the sacred garments, but they spit on God and the holy duties they were sworn to uphold. They used the priesthood just to steal and gorge their own dark appetites. Stick with me. Look at how they preyed on people bringing sacrifices. Whenever I brought a sacrifice to the altar, seeking God, the priest's servant would stalk toward me. In his fist, he gripped a heavy, three-pronged iron fork. While my sacred offering boiled, he would violently thrust that fork into my kettle or pot. Whatever flesh that jagged metal pulled up, the corrupt priest kept for himself. They humiliated every single one of us seeking faith here in Shiloh. The ancient laws of Moses promised the priests a fair, sacred portion of our humble sacrifices. But Eli's sons twisted the holy rules. They built a system of pure greed to steal more than their rightful share from us. They blindly stabbed our pots, ripping out the finest cuts of meat, the very pieces meant to be burned for our Creator, and the spiritual theft only grew darker. Before the sacred fat even touched the altar fire, the servant would confront me, demanding, "Hand over some raw meat for the priest to roast." He refuses your boiled scraps, he wants it bleeding and raw. And when I begged him, "Please let God's portion burn first, then take whatever you desire," the servant would sneer, "No, hand it over right now, or I will take it by force." I felt the crushing weight of this divine insult. The richest fat was our deepest surrender, meant entirely for God's altar. But Eli's sons ripped the offerings away before the smoke even rose, violently robbing the divine of what was holy, leaving me feeling entirely empty and disconnected. If I dared to object, they threatened my life. You and I know the terror of corrupt authority. The ancient text names this darkness. Their sin was massive before God. They treated my deepest spiritual offerings with absolute disgust, but their foul betrayal went far beyond stolen sacrifices. They used their sacred power to feed their darkest lusts. The aging high priest, Eli, heard the horrific rumors of what his sons did to us. I saw how they preyed upon the devoted women serving at the sanctuary doors. These women offered their lives to maintain the holy space, washing and preparing our sacred rituals. Instead of protecting them as vessels of God, those corrupt priests shattered their dignity, using them purely for selfish pleasure. When Eli discovered the truth, he confronted them, pleading, "Why do you commit such horrors? I hear from everyone in the camp about your sickening crimes against us." "Stop, my sons. The whispers spreading among our broken people are pure poison. If I wrong a neighbor, God might offer me mercy. But when you defile the Creator, who is left to plead your case?" Yet those arrogant men ignored him completely. Their hearts were hardened, their fatal judgment was already sealed. Eli spoke the truth, but I watched him cower as a father and a leader. He knew the depths of their depravity, yet he lacked the courage to actually stop them. He offered hollow lectures instead of real justice. I knew this cowardly failure in leadership would eventually bring absolute ruin to his bloodline and to my people. A prophet soon arrived, screaming judgment over Eli's house. As written in 1 Samuel chapter 2, verses 27 through 34, the spiritual sentence was brutally absolute. Both of those wicked brothers would perish on the exact same day. His entire family was cursed to die young, their sacred authority violently stripped away forever. But then I look at young Samuel, while the older priests destroyed our sacred trust. Turning my faith into ashes, this innocent boy quietly grew stronger. He was finding favor with God and us, secretly being molded in the shadows. He would become the spark to reignite my people's lost soul. I remember standing near that sacred tent late at night, when the camp finally slept. Heavy darkness swallowed us, pierced only by the golden lampstand that burned endlessly. Old, blind Eli was hidden away in his lonely chambers. Little Samuel lay, sleeping on the cold floor right beside the sacred ark. It felt like just another silent night of exile, but everything was about to shatter. I watched that boy serve God under a failing mentor. Back then, the divine voice felt dead. We wandered in a spiritual drought, starved of visions. That night, a frail and practically blind Eli rested heavily in his darkened corner. The eternal lamp still cast a faint glow across the temple stones as Samuel slept silently, resting right beside the terrifying presence of the almighty ark. Our history records a crushing truth. God's voice was tragically rare then. The heavens felt locked. I felt abandoned, wondering if we were utterly forgotten. Which makes the breaking of that silence so earth-shattering. In the dead of night, piercing my isolation, the Creator suddenly spoke the boy's name. Samuel, the very voice of existence echoed out, but the boy had no map for this encounter. Confused, he rushed to the old priest, saying, "Here I am." "You summoned me?" Eli merely groaned from his bed. "I didn't call you. Go back to sleep." I watched the eager, obedient child quietly return to the floor. Even ripped from a deep sleep, the boy frantically tried to serve his human master. Rejected, he lay back down in the dark, wrestling with a mystery he could not name. Then it pierced the silence a second time. "Samuel!" Once more he scrambled to Eli's side, insisting, "Here I am, you definitely called me." "My boy," Eli sighed. "I never called, just lie down." The child was blind to the spiritual reality. As the ancient scrolls confess, Samuel did not truly know his Creator yet. The living word remained a total mystery to him. I can feel the panic he must have felt in that dark room. Someone was speaking, but his mentor kept denying reality. Swallowing his fear, the child curled up again. Then came the third call. He stood up, trembling, marched back to Eli, and declared, "Here I am." "You called me?" Finally, the fog lifted from the old priest's mind. Through all his corruption, he suddenly recognized the terrifying weight of the divine. Eli knew God had bypassed the corrupt priests for a child. He whispered, "Go lay down. If the voice returns, tell it, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" Samuel slowly retreated to his mat. He carried the heavy blueprint of how to face the terror and beauty of the absolute unknown. My people's history pivoted in that exact heartbeat. The invisible God was stepping directly into his isolated world to forge a profound connection. The divine presence manifested, calling out just like before, "Samuel, Samuel." Voice shaking, the boy answered, "Speak, for your servant is listening." He embraced his fragile identity exactly as instructed. He surrendered his fear to the voice. It marked the painful birth of his prophetic soul. But the truth God delivered to the child was a devastating blow. It was a prophecy of utter ruin for Eli's bloodline, punishing the father's cowardly silence and the son's greed. The Creator told him, "Listen closely to me. I am about to unleash something upon Israel that will violently ring in the ears of all who survive. You and I must realize, our inner corruption always summons an unavoidable reckoning." The voice pierced the dark, declaring judgment on my mentor's family forever because of sins he ignored. His sons mocked the divine, and he did absolutely nothing. A heavy oath fell upon my young shoulders. The corruption rotting inside Eli's house could never be washed away by any sacrifice or offering. Imagine the crushing weight of that ancient mystery on my chest. The Creator was about to strike down my only family, punishing their deep spiritual corruption and blind neglect. A devastation so profound it would make human ears ring. I lay paralyzed in the shadows until dawn, consumed by the absolute terror of the unknown. You and I know the fear of destroying someone we love. My very first prophetic burden was a literal death sentence for the old man who raised me in the sacred tent. I kept my eyes shut until daylight broke, then mechanically opened the heavy sanctuary doors. My soul trembled. I was utterly terrified to share this dark vision. Morning came. I pushed the tabernacle doors wide, pretending everything was normal, but panic choked me. How could I deliver such devastating news? Would the old priest rage? Would he cast me out into the wilderness? I was a nervous, lonely kid trapped in a nightmare. But Eli demanded the truth, calling out, "Samuel, my son." "Here I am," I whispered, my voice shaking. "What did the mysterious voice say to you?" Eli pressed. "Do not hide a thing. May God deal with you mercilessly if you conceal anything." So I spilled the entire brutal truth, hiding nothing from the old man's weary eyes. Eli simply sighed. "He is the Lord. Let him do what is good." His surrender shattered me. No anger, no defensive rage against a scared kid. He didn't reject the divine warning or try to excuse his deep spiritual failures. He bowed to the tragic consequence of his sin, accepting eternal justice. He is the Lord doing what he must. Right there, my terrifying journey of exile began. I grew older, and the mysterious divine presence walked beside me. He ensured not a single word of mine ever fell empty to the ground. From Dan to Beersheba, the whole fractured nation realized my new identity, a chosen oracle. The spiritual visions kept coming at Shiloh, where unseen truths constantly flooded my mind. That midnight terror reshaped my very existence. I was growing up fast, not just physically, but descending deeper into a profound, isolated relationship with the divine. An unseen hand guided me, backing up every terrifying vision so my predictions never failed. From the northern edges down to the southern deserts of Dan to Beersheba. Everyone saw me as a sacred messenger stripped of a normal life. The ancient revelations never stopped. That first chilling night in the dark, hearing my own name, was only the spark of a lifelong, lonely communion with heaven. I was just a boy, born from a broken mother's desperate prayer, now burdened with saving a lost nation from its own ruin. In an era of intense psychological darkness and complete divine silence, I was dragged up to be a warning voice. I became the final judge, the first major prophet standing in the long shadow of Moses, desperately trying to bridge two turbulent eras of human history. Following that haunting encounter, my innocence vanished. I grew older, hardened by painful wisdom. I was no longer a simple child sweeping floors in a quiet tent. I stood as a young man chained to a sacred calling, delivering raw truths. The tragic collapse of Eli's family was merely the prologue. The visions kept crashing down, and I kept listening. The old scriptures in 1 Samuel chapter 3 record how the divine continued to manifest at Shiloh. Hidden truths invaded my mind, pouring heavily across all of Israel. I wasn't just hearing voices in the dark. I became the unwilling vessel, hauling harsh biblical truths to desperate crowds from the northern hills down to the southern deserts. Everyone sensed the terrifying shift. A real prophet stood among them. 1 Samuel chapter 3 verse 19 records my journey. The Creator was with me, and he let none of my words fall to the dust. What made my existence so heavy was the absolute certainty. Every grim prophecy materialized. Nothing was ever wasted. When I declared, "This is the divine word," men trembled. You and I know what it is like to crave direction. For generations, true spiritual guidance was utterly dead. We were a people wandering blind, completely disconnected from our spiritual map. The very priests who should have guarded our souls were rotting with greed. Eli was fading, his sons a plague upon the temple. The psychological darkness was suffocating. Out of that wasteland I emerged, a tired young man carrying fire from heaven. Broken strangers dragged themselves for miles to hear me. Anxious tribal chiefs begged for answers. Slowly, the quiet sanctuary boy was dying, replaced by something much heavier. I was morphing into a judge, forced to manage the chaos of their spiritual survival. In chapter 3 verse 20, it plainly states, "And all Israel recognized that I was established as a true prophet, from the bitter north of Dan, all the way down to the dusty southern limits." Of Beersheba, everyone knew a new ruler carried their fate. I never wanted this agonizing pressure. I didn't campaign to lose my private life to their endless needs. An unseen authority placed this yoke on me, violently opening doors and proving the visions true. The fractured tribes clung to me because they finally saw a man who wasn't just talking empty politics, but actually channeling divine wrath and hope. My transformation from a forgotten temple orphan to a national icon was an agonizing grind. It cost me years. I gained their respect and commanded their crowds, but the real cost was the terrifying, beautiful intimacy I was forced to build with heaven. The whispers didn't fade. The spiritual connection became a relentless, pulsing reality in my mind. All those lonely, silent years sweeping the temple floors were actually my brutal training ground. There beside the silent ark, I memorized the ancient history, the sacred laws, and the desperate rituals of our broken people. Suddenly, heaven was using my memories as a psychological map to drag these exiles back to their maker. When I opened my mouth, the crowds fell dead silent. When I pointed the way, they marched. Not because I carried a sword, but because they felt the terrifying weight of the divine resting on my fragile human shoulders. We couldn't know a slaughter was coming to test my fragile authority. The Philistines, our oldest nightmares, waited on the coast. They lived to raid our lands, strip our pride, burning homes and forcing us to our knees. They were a constant, brutal disease eating our borders. And now the shadow returned, vastly more destructive. 1 Samuel chapter 4 verse 1 simply states, "The Philistines assembled to crush us in battle." The silent fear of our two nations finally burst into absolute massacre. Looking back, we have to wonder what sparked such ruin. An invasion or a desperate rebellion against exile? Have you felt your identity slipping away? Stand with me as the armies gather. We camped near Ebenezer, the Philistines at Aphek. We were caught between our sacred mountains and their coastal plains, a natural slaughterhouse dividing our two completely different worlds. The clash hung over me like a shadow. Our shields gleamed, swords sharp, hearts pounding with fake courage. I marched into combat with my brothers. I honestly thought God would hand us an easy victory. Weren't we his chosen people? Didn't I have the Lord of armies on my side? But the reality of 1 Samuel chapter 4 broke me. The Philistines struck and my brothers fell. 4,000 of our men slaughtered in the dirt. 4,000 husbands, sons, and fathers who would never see home again. I stumbled back to the camp, completely crushed by the devastating loss around me. Wounded men groaned in agony beside me. Our commanders scrambled to rally the survivors, while one terrifying question echoed through my mind. Why did God abandon me? I watched our elders gather to make sense of the disaster, completely lost and drowning in desperation. In verse 3, I heard them ask, "Why did the Lord bring defeat upon us today before the Philistines?" Their sudden solution sounded so incredibly logical to me then. But it just proved how shallow my own faith had become. Still, in verse 3, they made their terrible choice. "Let us bring the ark of the covenant of the Lord from Shiloh, so it may go with us and save us from our enemies." Instead of dropping to my knees in repentance, I wanted to use the sacred ark like some cheap magic charm. I falsely believed the mere presence of this holy object guaranteed my victory. The ark was our most sacred relic, a gold-covered wooden chest holding the ancient laws given to Moses. It held hidden manna and Aaron's staff. Above it rested 2 golden cherubim, and between their wings, I believed the very presence of God dwelled. It was the ultimate anchor of our spiritual identity. As verse 4 records, we sent desperate men running all the way back to Shiloh. They returned carrying the ark of the Lord Almighty, enthroned between the cherubim, and trailing right behind it came Eli's 2 corrupt sons, Hophni and Phinehas, walking alongside the holy ark of God. When that sacred chest rolled into our camp, my soul erupted with overwhelming joy. Verse 5 perfectly captures the moment the covenant arrived. All of us raised a shout so loud the earth literally shook beneath my feet. I thought my victory was finally guaranteed. You and I have probably made this same mistake, thinking we can control God. Across the valley, the Philistines heard my celebration and panicked. They knew the ancient stories of my God, how he dragged us out of Egypt through devastating plagues and absolute miracles. In verse 8, they screamed out, "Woe to us! Who will save us from the hands of these mighty gods? These are the beings who crushed the Egyptians with plagues out in the wild." But pushing through their own terror, the enemy commanders rallied their terrified troops. In verse 9, they ordered, "Be strong, Philistines, be men. Or you will become slaves to the Hebrews just as they have been to you. Be brave and fight." The second nightmare was imminent. At dawn, I lined up again for brutal combat. Across the dirt stood the Philistines, swallowing their fear to fight to the bitter end. And on my side of the line, I stood there dripping with false confidence, worshipping the wooden box beside me. At our dead center stood Hophni and Phinehas, those corrupt priests guarding our holy relic. Horns blew, guttural screams tore through the air, and I surged forward. Bronze swords violently shattered against heavy wooden shields. Arrows shrieked past my face, blinding dust choking me as brothers dropped dead. 1 Samuel 4:10 records the horrific truth. The Philistines struck hard and my entire world shattered. I ran for my life. The carnage was absolute hell. We lost 30,000 bleeding men in the dirt. It was a trauma beyond human words. Then verse 11 delivered the lethal blow to my soul. God's ark was taken, and Eli's 2 boys lay dead. I hadn't just lost a bloody war. I lost the spiritual map of my identity. The physical symbol of God's presence was dragged away by our pagan enemies, and just as promised, those corrupt sons bled out on the exact same day. I picture those soldiers swarming my sacred ark, wiping blood on it with filthy hands, laughing at my silent God. A few probably flinched, remembering the terrifying legends of my God's ancient power, but the bloodshed made them arrogant. After all, if my God was truly real, why did he let himself be captured? I stared at the lifeless bodies of Hophni and Phinehas rotting in the mud, fulfilling the dark prophecy against Eli's bloodline. The men who mocked the holy altars and weaponized their sacred power were finally gone forever. Their religious corruption was over, but for a survivor like me, it was a terrified sprint into exile. I ran home, completely broken and hollowed out. How do I look my family in the eye after this? How do I whisper to them that we lost the literal presence of God? I watched a man from Benjamin sprint from the gore straight toward Shiloh. Verse 12 says he showed up with ripped clothes and a dust-covered head, drowning in profound, unending spiritual grief. The whole city instantly felt the cold weight of the tragedy. In verse 13, the ancient text reveals, when he arrived, Eli was sitting on his chair by the road, his heart trembling with fear for God's ark. That traumatized messenger brought devastating news that permanently shattered my entire religious identity. He didn't realize it, but his gasping words fulfilled a haunting prophecy given to a young boy who once heard a whisper in the dark. I picture old Eli rotting in his chair by the city gate. 98 years old, heavy and totally blind. He sat there suffocating on his anxiety, desperate for news. The military loss wasn't what kept him awake. It was the horrifying fate of our covenant ark that made his old heart violently tremble. 1 Samuel 4:13 reports, when the man told the town, everyone started screaming. I still hear the agonizing wails tearing through Shiloh's streets. Widows weeping for my dead brothers, terrified kids, and old men realizing our true spiritual exile had just begun. We all face the day our illusions shatter. Verse 14 says, Eli heard the panic and asked, "What is this uproar?" Even blind, his aging ears knew the sound of a completely shattered world. The bleeding messenger rushed over to hand him our absolute destruction. I was standing right beside the gate when the breathless soldier finally collapsed. He gasped to Eli, "I just ran from the slaughter. I fled the front lines today." The old man whispered, "What happened, my son?" The soldier's answer was a crushing blow. 4 waves of sheer terror, each darker than the last. "Our ranks completely broke," the soldier cried out. "We were slaughtered by the Philistines. Both your sons, Hophni and Phinehas, lie dead in the dirt, and the ark of God, the enemy, took it." I watched the color completely drain from Eli's face. The very moment that soldier mentioned our captured ark, the blind priest simply collapsed, toppling backward off his heavy seat right by the city gate. I heard the sickening snap of his neck. The heavy old man who guided our souls for 40 long years died right there in the dust. Just like that, 4 decades of our spiritual leadership vanished into nothing. I knew the truth. It was never the bitter news of our military defeat that killed him, nor the brutal deaths of his boys. Losing the ark completely shattered his spirit. He failed miserably as a father, yes, but I saw how deeply he loved our Lord. He held a profound, absolute reverence for that holy golden chest. Knowing our sacred identity, the literal weight of divine presence, was dragged away by pagan enemies was simply too much. His frail, old heart could not survive that absolute spiritual exile. But the horrific shadow over his house only grew darker. I remember hearing the bitter news about his pregnant daughter-in-law, the young wife of Phinehas. She was so close to delivering her child. When the terrifying rumors reached her, the holy ark stolen, her husband slaughtered, her father-in-law dead, the sheer trauma threw her into sudden labor. The agonizing physical and spiritual pain completely overwhelmed her failing body. I picture the desperate midwives trying to soothe her, crying out that she had a healthy baby boy. But she was entirely lost to the crushing darkness. She stared blankly, refusing their comfort. With her dying breath, she gave the innocent child a truly haunting name. She wept that true glory had been stripped away from us. Our sacred ark was utterly gone, and the leaders of her broken family were nothing but cold corpses. "The glory has vanished," she gasped, "because the ark is taken." The name Ichabod means no glory, a devastating burden for a newborn, yet it perfectly mirrored my own crushing sense of isolation and national despair. Our holy light was truly extinguished. The absolute core of my faith was locked away in hostile territory, and our high priest lay dead. The Philistines completely owned us now. I wandered through the bleakest, loneliest days of my life. With Eli's bloodline utterly severed and our holy relics stolen, I felt entirely abandoned. A massive era slammed shut. The old spiritual order crumbled to dust, exactly as the harsh, mysterious visions had warned young Samuel so long ago. We looked to Samuel, our rising prophet, to guide us through the void. But as I wept in the ashes, our bitter enemies fiercely celebrated. They actually thought they had conquered my God. Treating our deepest spiritual truth like a cheap war prize, they boldly hauled the sacred ark down to Ashdod. It was their coastal stronghold. I heard they dragged it straight into the dark, towering temple of their idol, Dagon, mocking everything I held eternally sacred. They proudly paraded it from the bloody fields of Ebenezer all the way to Ashdod. They locked it in the shadows, placing it right beside Dagon's monstrous statue as a sick joke. Dagon was their supreme idol, a grotesque half-man, half-fish. Trapping our ark next to him was pure psychological warfare. They were loudly declaring to the world, "Our deity completely crushed the God of Israel." It felt like a fatal blow to my own identity. But the very next morning, those arrogant captors woke up to a truly chilling, supernatural terror. When their priests walked in at dawn, they found Dagon completely collapsed, face down in the dirt, bowing before the ark of my God. Panicking, they rushed to prop their lifeless idol back up. I can see their trembling hands, the sheer terror of finding their supreme protector submitting to my exiled God. They quickly hoisted him back onto his pedestal, frantically trying to hide the ominous warning. They probably lied to themselves, blaming a weak foundation or a sudden tremor. But by the following sunrise, the terrifying spiritual reality could no longer be ignored. When they nervously unbarred the heavy temple doors the next morning, their mighty Dagon was once again smashed face first into the cold floor before our sacred ark. But this time, his head and hands were violently severed, tossed near the doorway like garbage. Only a useless stump remained. My God left them no room for comfortable, rational excuses. He didn't just tip over. He was brutally decapitated and dismembered. Even in our bitter exile, my God was fiercely alive, publicly shaming their false deity in the heart of their own city. Yet the terrifying nightmare for them was just beginning. Soon, a deeply agonizing, mysterious plague rapidly swept through the panicked streets of Ashdod. The unseen, heavy hand of heaven completely crushed them. A devastating sickness suddenly broke out, ravaging everyone in the entire region with grotesque, unbearable physical tumors. These agonizing physical sores spread like absolute wildfire. The deep terror was palpable. They finally realized their horrific suffering was directly tied to holding my sacred identity, the stolen presence of our God, hostage. Drowning in raw fear, the frantic city leaders decided our holy chest had to go. "Get the God of Israel out of here," the terrified citizens cried as the bodies piled up. "His invisible hand is totally destroying us, tearing apart our lives and crushing our mighty Dagon." In pure panic, they dragged all 5 powerful Philistine warlords into an emergency council. I can only imagine their desperate, trembling voices echoing in the chamber, asking, "What do we do with this terrifying God of Israel?" The blind rulers foolishly ordered it shipped off to Gath. They nervously hauled it away, but simply moving my God only shifted the relentless epicenter of their absolute ruin. The exact same horrific nightmare instantly erupted in Gath, the very moment our golden chest crossed their city borders. Unseen divine fury descended, throwing the entire population into violent hysteria. Young and old alike were suddenly struck down, writhing in the streets with the very same excruciating physical tumors. Sweating and terrified, the broken men of Gath violently shoved the ark toward Ekron. But as that heavy golden chest approached the gates, I heard the people of Ekron absolutely lost their minds. They shrieked into the terrified sky, "They brought this Hebrew god here to slaughter us all." And they were right. The holy presence hit Ekron like an unstoppable, agonizing tidal wave of suffering. The horrific death toll surged so high, they urgently demanded the warlords return to fix their fatal mistake. "Send it away," they screamed. "Return the God of Israel to his own place, or we are all dead men." The sheer psychological weight of my God's invisible anger draped their entire city in utter, fatal despair. The bleeding survivors writhed in agony, their haunting screams echoing toward the heavens. For 7 long months, our captured identity was passed around their cities like a curse, leaving nothing but plague and cemeteries behind. They took our holiest relic, arrogant enough to believe they had completely conquered my very soul. But sitting in the ashes of my ruined life, I realized something profound. My God wasn't a hostage. He was systematically, undeniably dismantling the gods of this world from the inside out. 7 months of pure agony. My enemies were begging to lose the sacred ark. Plague tore through their streets. They felt the crushing weight of my God punishing them for stealing what was completely holy. 1 Samuel chapter 6 verse 12 records. When the ark of the Lord had been in their territory 7 agonizing months, they called their pagan priests and diviners, pleading, "What do we do with this holy ark? Tell us how to send it back." Their priests knew they couldn't just return our sacred chest empty-handed. They had to buy off the wrath of my God with blood or gold. In verse 3 they warned, "If you return the ark, do not send it back without a gift, offer a guilt offering. Then you will heal and finally understand why his heavy hand remains upon your throats." Asked how to pay for their sin, they gave a bizarre answer. In verses 4 and 5 they commanded 5 gold tumors and 5 gold rats, matching the number of your warlords, because the exact same plague broke you and your leaders. Craft models of the sickness and the rats destroying your soil, and bow to Israel's God. Maybe he will stop crushing you, your false idols, and your broken land. Strange to you and me today, but to ancient minds, those gold tumors perfectly mirrored their disease. The gold rats symbolized the scavengers eating their crops, or the very carriers of their death, by forging idols of their own agonizing pain. My enemies prayed my God would remove the real curse. Their priests still remembered how Egypt broke when they fought him. In verse 6 they asked, "Why harden your hearts like the stubborn Egyptians and their Pharaoh did? When he crushed them, didn't they finally let Israel go?" They were terrified of repeating history, afraid of drawing down an even darker, deeper judgment. So they prepared to send our identity back. Verses 7 and 8 tell us, "Get a brand new cart and 2 nursing cows that have never worn a yoke. Hitch the cows to the cart, but lock their calves away. Take the ark of the Lord, place it on the wood and in a chest right next to it. Pack the gold figures as your guilt offering, then let it go." This was a desperate psychological test. Nursing mothers never abandon their young. If these beasts fought their own nature to carry our holy chest home without a guide, it meant the hand of my God was pulling the strings. Verse 9 reveals their trembling logic. "Watch it closely. If it climbs toward its own border at Beit Shemesh, then his Lord brought this disaster on us. But if not, we will know his hand didn't strike us, and it was just blind luck." My enemies followed this dark ritual perfectly. They loaded the holy ark and the golden guilt offering onto the cart, locked the crying calves in the barn, and released the cows. The supernatural sight still haunts me. Verse 12 reads, "Then the cows went straight up toward Beit Shemesh, moaning the entire way down the dirt road, never once turning to the right or the left. The Philistine kings trailed them to our border. Defying every natural instinct to protect their young, the beasts marched right back into my homeland. No driver steered that wood. No man guided the yoke. It was my God, alone in the silence, pulling his own presence home. I was down in the valley harvesting wheat when it happened. I looked up, saw the ark, and wept with joy." Verse 14 says, "The cart entered the field of Joshua of Beit Shemesh, stopping by a massive stone. The people smashed the cart's wood and burned the cows as an offering to the Lord. The Levites, the only ones legally allowed to handle the holy vessel under Moses' law, lowered our sacred chest and the golden idols onto the rock. We offered sacrifices to the Lord that very afternoon, celebrating our restored faith and identity. The 5 enemy lords watched us, then fled back to Ekron. Their terrifying nightmare with our God was finally over. They learned in blood and disease that the Creator was stronger than stone idols. He was never just a piece of war loot to be captured. But not everyone in my town showed proper fear. Some, poisoned by foolish curiosity, actually peeked inside the sacred chest. An act of absolute treason banned even for the priests. Verse 19 warns, "But God struck down some of the men of Beit Shemesh." Killing 70 of us just for looking into the ark, we wept bitterly over the brutal slaughter, paralyzed by the sheer terror of his pure, untouchable holiness. Trembling, we asked the question burning in verse 20. Who can survive the presence of this intensely holy God? Where can we send the ark to get it away from us? Desperate, I watched us send runners to the people of Kirjath-Jearim. Verse 21 says, we told them, "The enemy returned the ark of the Lord. Come down and take it away to your city." Just like that, we pushed God away to the house of Abinadab in Kirjath-Jearim, hiding him for years. The physical exile was over. The holy chest was home. But deep down, our fractured political and spiritual identity was still bleeding out, begging for restoration. Healing our souls became Samuel's burden. For 20 silent years, the ark sat hidden in Abinadab's house at Kirjath-Jearim. Over those decades, Samuel's voice grew louder in my mind. With the old priests dead and Shiloh abandoned, he became the one true guide for our lost, wandering generation. 1 Samuel chapter 7 verse 2 says, "Then all the people of Israel turned back to the Lord." That tiny verse proves that for 2 bitter, miserable decades, I had been drowning in spiritual darkness. We chased hollow idols, completely losing our faith after the trauma and shame of our past defeats. But the ice in my heart was finally melting. Samuel sensed the shift and stepped up. I was starving for real identity, a true, spiritual awakening that brought me back to my ancient roots. So in verse 3, Samuel stared us down and commanded, "If you are actually returning to the Lord with everything inside you, you and I must smash our fake gods. Tear down the idols, commit your mind only to him, and he will finally break the grip of our deepest fears." Today, you and I will step into this ancient story. Samuel's voice pierced my soul. Repenting meant taking hard action. Empty words to our Maker weren't enough. I had to smash my idols, the foreign gods, the agonizing grip of Ashtoreth, the fertility idol the nations around us obsessed over. To my utter shock, we actually did it. The ancient text says we tore down our statues, destroying the Baals, choosing to serve the Lord alone. I was desperate to change, terrified of losing my true identity to dead gods. Seeing our broken spirits, Samuel pushed us even deeper. He demanded a massive gathering. The scripture remembers his chilling words, "Bring all Israel to Mizpah, and I will plead with the Lord for you." Mizpah was entirely exposed, a high, windy city visible from miles away. It was the perfect place to hide nothing. We walked from every dusty corner of Israel. No one forced my hand. I hiked to Mizpah starving for the truth. I desperately wanted my God back. On that mountain, we dragged our hidden sins into the blazing daylight. The sacred text says we fasted, crying out, "We have sinned against the Lord." The sharp hunger in my stomach matched my heavy grief. I was mourning my own spiritual exile, and the confession pouring from my lips wasn't some empty noise. I cried out, "We have sinned against the Lord." I finally realized my choices weren't just bad habits or blending in with the culture. It was absolute treason against the living God. I stopped making pathetic excuses and owned my darkness. Samuel felt the shift in our souls. The verse records, now Samuel was serving as leader of Israel at Mizpah. This ancient book finally names him our judge. He wasn't just a voice in the wilderness anymore. He was holding our fractured, frightened society together. But then the ruthless Philistines heard we were gathering. They smelled blood, assuming our spiritual search was an armed, violent rebellion. The text warns, when the Philistines heard Israel assembled at Mizpah, their brutal warlords marched right up to slaughter us all. When I heard their marching footsteps, cold terror completely paralyzed me. I still had nightmares about the massacre years ago, 30,000 of my brothers butchered in the dirt. My heart stopped at facing them again. We begged Samuel for our lives. I pleaded, "Do not stop crying out to the Lord our God so he might save us from their bloody hands." You and I both know the danger of false security. Last time death approached, we treated the sacred ark like some cheap, magical weapon. A lucky charm to fix my fear. Now I just begged a broken prophet to pray. I dropped my superstitions and pleaded for heaven's mercy. Through the haunting prayer of one man, Samuel answered my deep despair. The scripture says, Samuel took a nursing lamb, sacrificing it completely to the Lord. He screamed into the violent sky for us, and God actually listened. That burning lamb was me, completely helpless, begging for unmerited divine grace. The rising smoke was my entire identity, completely surrendered, and the universe answered instantly. Verse 10 reveals, while Samuel was burning the lamb, the Philistines closed in to wipe us entirely off the map. But then the sky tore apart. The Lord crushed them with a deafening, terrifying roar, sending my enemies into absolute madness. The impossible became my reality. A cosmic crack of lightning completely shattered the minds of the men hunting me down. I barely held a sword. The Creator of the stars fought my battle. I just watched them break. Verse 11 says, the men of Israel rushed out of Mizpah, striking down the Philistines all the way to the valley below Beit Kar. I was a trembling coward 10 minutes ago. Now, fueled by wild faith, I charged. It is terrifying how encountering God transforms a shattered mind. To anchor this surreal psychological shift in history, Samuel did something that stopped me cold. He planted a massive rock between Mizpah and Shen. He called it Ebenezer, declaring into the wind, "Thus far the Lord has helped us." It was just a crude, heavy rock, but to me it meant everything. A permanent scar on the earth proving I was actually saved. The irony choked me. Right here near Ebenezer was where I watched my brothers bleed out years ago. Now it was totally holy ground. That solitary stone crushed my human ego. Samuel's words, "Thus far the Lord has helped us," shattered any illusion that I could save myself. I survived because of him, not my own pathetic strength. And looking at that rock, I knew the architect of my soul wouldn't abandon me. My vicious oppressors were so totally devastated they vanished into the shadows for years. Verse 13 documents this shocking silence. The Philistines were crushed, stopping their violent raids on my home. As long as Samuel breathed, the Lord's heavy hand kept them away. I wasn't naive. I knew my outer demons would eventually return. They haunted us again during the turbulent days of Saul and David. But under Samuel's shadow, I finally slept in peace. The monsters of my past couldn't consume my future anymore, and miraculously, the healing continued. I watched my people take back the shattered pieces of our stolen lives. Verse 14 proves it. The towns stolen from us were fully restored, from Ekron to Gath. We ripped our homeland from Philistine jaws, reclaiming our sacred borders. And there was profound peace between Israel and the Amorites. I tasted true freedom. We didn't just barely survive the dark battlefield. I watched us take back our lost identity. Ekron and Gath were massive fortresses of my enemy. What do you and I do when our lost souls are restored? The entire coast was ours again. The peace was supernatural, healing my deepest wounds. The stone of Ebenezer gave us breathing room. That victory sent shockwaves through our enemies. Our borders finally quieted down. With the terror fading, Samuel turned to healing our shattered nation. In verse 15, the ancient texts say Samuel judged us his whole life. He was no king. He carried no sword, commanded no standing army. We followed him simply because God's Spirit rested heavily upon him. He was our tether to the divine, and he never hid behind palace walls waiting for our brokenness to find him. He came to us. Instead, verse 16 tells us he walked the dusty roads of Israel. Year after year, he marched that relentless circuit, moving from Bethel to Gilgal, then up to Mizpah. He held our fragile tribes together in those key cities. We felt seen. We felt anchored. His endless journeys meant even the most isolated of us weren't forgotten. He scattered justice across the land instead of hoarding it in one high tower. He walked into our mess so we wouldn't have to wander the wilderness seeking truth. Yet even a prophet needs a sanctuary, a place to lay his weary head. Verse 17 tells us he always drifted back to Ramah. That was his home. There he settled our disputes, and there he stacked stones to build an altar to our God. Ramah became our spiritual heartbeat. You and I must remember our trauma. The ark was exiled in Kiriath Jearim, and our sacred tabernacle at Shiloh lay in absolute ruins, likely reduced to ashes. The prophet Jeremiah later suggests the Philistines slaughtered Shiloh. Right after stealing our ark, we were spiritually orphaned. Yet Samuel refused to let our faith bleed out entirely. He kept us tied to heaven through desperate sacrifices and quiet festivals. He dragged us into a new era. After Eli died and the ark was ripped from our hands, he rebuilt the bridge between our shattered souls and the Almighty. Under his gaze, we finally breathed. We found spiritual awakening, silenced our enemies, and tasted true peace. We knew his power wasn't human charisma, though his presence commanded absolute silence. It was his terrifying, unwavering obedience. He dragged us back to our knees, forced us to weep for our sins, and trusted heaven to fight our battles. That Ebenezer stone stood as a brutal reminder: we are nothing without him. Thus far, the Lord has helped us. Samuel was the fading twilight of the judges, closing a chaotic chapter that started with Othniel long after Joshua was buried. But he was also our first real prophet. He sparked a bloodline of fearless men who would hurl God's unfiltered truth right into our faces. And soon he'd be forced to crown our darkest temptation, the era of human kings. The seasons ground on. I watched Samuel, our bedrock, begin to crack under the heavy weight of time. His dark beard faded to bone white. The hands he once raised to summon thunderstorms now shook like dry leaves. Eyes that had witnessed heaven's raw fire were growing dim and cloudy. In 1 Samuel chapter 8 verse 1, it records that when Samuel grew frail, he appointed his own sons to judge us. A perfectly natural choice. His legs couldn't walk the agonizing circuit anymore. He needed blood he could trust to hear our disputes, and who better to carry the torch than his own boys. Men who had eaten at his table, breathing in his deep reverence for the divine. Verse 2 names them: Joel the firstborn and Abijah the second, and they served down in Beersheba. Beersheba sat at the very bottom of our world, a vital checkpoint bordering the scorching Negev desert. Putting them there meant he trusted them with our most critical conflicts. I'm sure he prayed they would mirror his pure heart, weighing our lives with holy fear. But a sickness crept in. Verse 3 confirms our nightmares. His sons did not walk his path. They chased dirty silver, pocketed bribes, and twisted our justice into something unrecognizable. I can't fathom the crushing shame Samuel felt. After bleeding for this nation's soul, his own flesh embraced the shadows. They possessed none of his fire. Where he washed our wounds, they bled us dry. Where he demanded truth, they demanded coin. He fought temptation. They practically invited it in. The stench of their greed drifted north, and our nervous whispers turned into roars. We all knew the dark truth. If you went to court in Beersheba without a heavy pouch of silver, those boys would ruin you, the poorest among us. The ones begging for heaven's protection became their easiest prey. You and I can see the terrifying loop of history. It was the exact same nightmare Eli lived through. Eli's boys, Hophni and Phinehas, had corrupted the holy tent itself. Samuel had watched that horror unfold with his own eyes. He saw the blood, the divine wrath wiping out Eli's bloodline. Yet here he was, powerless to stop his own boys from stepping into that exact same curse. We couldn't just watch this happen. We elders had to stop this rot before it consumed us. Land, lives, and freedom were being traded for cheap payoffs instead of truth. How could we, a nation carved out by God himself, stomach this evil? Panic drove us elders to make a desperate, terrifying gamble. Chapter 8 verse 4 tells us, "So all the elders of Israel gathered together and marched to Samuel at Ramah." Put yourself in our sandals. The patriarchs of every tribe, faces hardened by fear and anger, converging on that quiet town where the old prophet lived. We were united by a terrifying resolve. We had an ultimatum to deliver. Standing before the man who saved us, we didn't blink. Verse 5 records our exact words. "Look, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Give us a king to judge us, just like all the other nations." We watched that sentence pierce him. Yes, his bones were failing. Yes, his boys were a disgrace. But the cure we demanded, the venom we were inviting in. A human king, just like the pagans around us, sickened him completely. Verse 6 reveals the request was utterly evil in Samuel's eyes when we demanded a monarch. So he collapsed before the Lord in prayer. Why was he so shattered? He knew we weren't just discarding his lifetime of service or his broken sons. We were rejecting the very sanctuary of God's unseen rule. He knew exactly what human kings do. They hoard, they conquer, and they enslave their own citizens. He felt the tragic shift in our hearts. We were terrified of standing alone. We traded our sacred identity just to blend in with a fallen world. And so, the weeping prophet carried our betrayal back to God. Reading this, I become Saul. In verses 7 and 8, God gave Samuel a terrifying new perspective. The Lord responds, "Listen to the crowd. They haven't rejected you. They have utterly rejected me as their true king." Those words hit my soul. You and I read this as history, but I feel the weight of my own rebellion. Just as they forsook God since Egypt, they were doing to Samuel. The problem was far deeper than simple politics. This was a profound spiritual crisis. My people weren't merely ditching the judges. They were actively rejecting the Almighty as their sovereign king. We were trapped in a toxic cycle of rebellion born in the desert. Then God told Samuel exactly how to handle our stubbornness. In verse 9, he commands, "Listen but solemnly warn them. Show them the brutal reality of the earthly king they are begging for, completely faithful to the Lord." Samuel came back to us, the elders, and painted a dark, vivid picture of life under a human ruler. Forget about ease and comfort. Through verses 11 to 17, Samuel described the nightmare. Our sons dragged into his standing army, our daughters forced to serve his palace. He would seize the absolute best of our lands and bury us under heavy taxes. Then came the chilling warning in verse 18. When that dark day arrives, you will scream for relief from the tyrant you chose, but the Lord will remain completely silent. It was a brutal, serious warning. Samuel was basically pleading with us. Think hard about this. An earthly king will drain your soul and give nothing back. Once regret sets in, it's too late. But we absolutely refuse to listen to reason. Verse 19 captures our tragic, stubborn blindness. We entirely shut out Samuel's voice. "No," my people shouted over him, "we demand a king." And in verse 20, our deepest insecurity spilled out. We want to be exactly like the other nations, with a king to march out and fight our battles for us. Looking closely, two dark motivations drove us. First, the intense pressure to fit in. We were exhausted from carrying the heavy burden of being different. We wanted to drop our unique, sacred identity and just blend into the surrounding pagan nations. Second, we desperately needed someone else to fight our wars. We were terrified of relying on an invisible God. Genuine faith felt too hard, too lonely. A human army felt safe, tangible, an instant cure for our profound spiritual anxiety. Samuel absorbed our anxious demands and carried them to God. The Lord's answer in verse 22 was chillingly simple and direct. Listen to them and hand them a king. A heavy new chapter was unfolding in Israel. The messy era of the judges was dying, and the terrifying age of human kings was taking over my life. When God moves, he uses the painfully ordinary. Stick with me here, this is where I step into the story. In chapter 9, my destiny began with some lost donkeys. Verse 3 perfectly captures my mundane, frustrating reality. The donkeys belonging to my father, Kish, wandered off, so my father looked at me and said, "Take a servant and go track them down." A simple, exhausting chore. I had absolutely no idea this desperate hunt would permanently rewrite my identity. We dragged ourselves through endless hills and dead-end valleys, finding nothing. After a brutal, lonely search, I was totally defeated. In verse 5, my anxiety kicked in. "Come. Let's turn back right now, or my father will stop caring about the donkeys and start panicking about us." But my servant pushed back. In verse 6, he offered a lifeline. "Look, there's a highly respected man of God in this town. Everything he predicts happens. Let's go ask him. Maybe he can fix this mess." He was talking about Samuel, though his name remained unspoken. My servant just knew there was a prophet nearby whose divine insight might save us from failure. I froze with insecurity. We had 0 gifts to offer this seer. But my servant scraped together a tiny piece of silver, so we pressed on into the terrifying unknown. What I couldn't possibly know was that God had already been whispering my name to Samuel. Verse 15 reveals the unseen reality. The day before I even arrived, the Lord had uncovered this secret to Samuel. In verse 16, God explicitly told him, "About this time tomorrow I will send you a Benjamite. Anoint him ruler over my people. He will rescue them from the Philistines. I have seen their suffering, and their desperate cries have finally reached me." This is what terrifies me. God was moving in the shadows. The donkeys weren't lost by accident. My servant's push wasn't just some lucky coincidence. It was all a divine trap pulling me directly towards Samuel. Entering town, we bumped into some young women drawing water and desperately asked where to find him. They explained he had just arrived for a sacred sacrifice. They told us to sprint if we wanted to catch him before he sat down to feast with his honored guests. And then in verse 17, the collision happens. When Samuel locked eyes with me, God whispered, "This is the man, he will govern my people." Imagine the heavy silence between us. There I stood, unknowingly marked as Israel's first king. I wasn't a famous warrior or some charismatic leader. I was just an exhausted kid chasing livestock through the dirt. But God pierces through human illusions. He examines the isolated heart. I walked up to Samuel at the gate, completely clueless, asking for the seer. Samuel answered, "I am the seer. Walk ahead of me to the high place. Today you will feast with me. Tomorrow morning I will send you off and reveal everything hidden deep inside your anxious heart. Forget the donkeys you lost 3 days ago. They are found. And who is all the burning, desperate desire of Israel fixed upon, if not you and your entire family line?" My breath completely caught in my throat. How did he know about my donkeys? And what on earth did that terrifying phrase, "the desire of Israel," even mean? Drowning in confusion, my imposter syndrome spilled out in verse 21. Am I not a Benjamite, the absolute smallest tribe? My clan is the lowest of the entire tribe. Why are you speaking to me like this? I couldn't process this crushing new reality. I felt so incredibly small, so entirely inadequate. How could the immense, terrifying weight of a whole nation's hope be placed on my fragile shoulders? But Samuel offered zero comfort or explanation. Instead, he led me and my servant straight to the sacrifice, forcing me into the highest seat of honor among the guests. He served me the finest cut of meat. Later, under the stars on his rooftop, we spoke in the heavy, quiet darkness. As dawn broke the next morning, Samuel told me to send my servant away. He had a message that would shatter my identity forever. What would you and I do with that kind of terrifying calling? Have you ever felt the crushing weight of a destiny you didn't choose? The servant left. Suddenly, it was just me and the old prophet. He took a flask of oil and poured it straight over my head. The ancient text says he kissed me, whispering that God had anointed me ruler over his people. I was utterly paralyzed. I had only left home to find some missing donkeys. Now I was being crowned the first king of Israel. That thick oil dripping down my face felt heavy, like the Spirit of God crashing into my soul, demanding I become something entirely new. To prove this was real, Samuel promised me 3 signs for my journey home. First, near Rachel's tomb, 2 men would run up and tell me the donkeys were already safe. Next, 3 men heading to worship at Bethel would cross my path and hand me 2 loaves of bread. Finally, I would collide with a wild procession of prophets. And the Spirit of God would consume me, forcing my lips to prophesy alongside them. Samuel left me with one final, haunting instruction. He told me once these signs happen, do whatever my hands find to do, because God is with me. Then he ordered me down to Gilgal. He promised to follow me there to sacrifice burnt offerings, but I was commanded to wait 7 agonizing days for him to reveal my next steps. Everything unfolded exactly as he predicted. When I met that band of prophets, a divine terror seized me, and I started speaking ancient truths right alongside them. My own friends stared at me like I was a stranger. They whispered, "What happened to the son of Kish? Is he a prophet now?" That single moment shattered my old identity. As I walked away from Samuel, God completely rewired my heart, and every single sign came to pass. I was being torn down and rebuilt from the inside out. Meanwhile, Samuel called the entire nation of Israel to gather before him at Mizpah. It was time to drag my secret out into the blinding light. Samuel reminded the massive crowd how God had dragged our ancestors out of Egypt and crushed our oppressors. Then his voice turned sharp. He told us we had rejected the very God who saves us from disaster, demanding a human king to rule over us instead. It was a chilling reality check. By begging for an earthly leader, we were essentially exiling our true divine king. Still, Samuel followed God's command and began the terrifying lottery. The 12 tribes stepped forward. My tribe, Benjamin, was singled out. Then my clan was called. Finally, my own name echoed across the valley. It was the public execution of the private choice God had already made. But when the crowd searched for me, I was gone. The people had to beg the Lord for an answer, asking if I had even arrived. You and I both know the urge to hide when pressure hits. I was cowering behind the supply wagons, the chosen king buried in the luggage. I was suffocating under the fear of expectations, desperately trying to outrun my destiny. But you can never hide from a calling that God ordains. The mob dragged me out into the open. I stood trembling in the center of the assembly, physically towering a full head above every single person. Staring down at them, I heard Samuel shout, "Do you see the man the Lord God has chosen? There is absolutely no one else like him in the entire nation." The deafening roar of the crowd hit me. "Long live the king!" Samuel then laid out the heavy burdens of kingship, documenting them on a scroll. He placed that scroll before God, then sent everyone away. I walked back to my home in Giah. I wasn't totally alone. Fierce warriors whose hearts God had deeply touched marched with me. But rebels sneered, asking how a broken man like me could save anyone, bringing zero tribute. I swallowed my pride and kept entirely silent. That was how my reign began, anointed in the shadows, exposed in the daylight, praised by some, hated by others. Time would expose if I was truly the leader Israel needed. With my crown now secure, Samuel realized his lifelong era as judge was finally fading out. It was time for him to pass the crushing weight of leadership to me. After I proved myself in battle against the Ammonites, Samuel seized the moment. He stood before the massive crowd and declared to Israel, "I have given you exactly what you demanded, a king over you." He was officially declaring that my reign had permanently replaced his guidance. We asked for an idol, and God gave us what we wanted. Samuel reminded us all that he had been our faithful shepherd since he was a boy. He pointed straight at me. "Now you have a king to lead you. I am just old and gray now. I have walked before you, bearing this burden from my youth until this very day." Before walking into the shadows, the old prophet needed to clear his legacy. He stared us down and asked a piercing question. "Here I stand, testify against me before God and before me his anointed. Whose ox have I stolen? Who have I cheated? Who among you have I ever oppressed? Who has ever handed me a bribe to look the other way? If I am guilty, I will repay it all." It was an intensely courageous challenge to us. He was daring anyone he might have broken to step forward. If he had stolen property, twisted justice, or taken dirty money. Now was the moment to ruin him, but the crowd's voice roared back as one. We told him, "You haven't cheated us or taken a single thing from anyone." The old man pressed harder. "The Lord is witness, and your new king is witness today, that my hands are completely clean of your blood." We shouted back, "He is witness." That flawless public record was absolutely staggering to witness. Decades in absolute power, yet not a single soul could claim corruption. Unlike his own corrupt sons, his soul was clean, with his legacy locked in place. Samuel forced us to look at our own broken history. He reminded us how God dragged us out of Egypt, and how quickly our minds had erased those miracles. He showed us how God let our enemies crush us when we sinned, only to send saviors the second we fell to our knees in agony. It was a brutal realization that God had always been our only king. Then he exposed the fear that made us demand a human shield. When you saw Nahash marching against you, you panicked. You demanded a mortal king, rejecting the Lord. So ask yourself, what divine presence are you and I still trying to replace today? Our demand for a king wasn't about serving God. You and I both know the truth. It was pure panic. We just wanted to fit in with the nations around us. I felt the guilt. We had completely stopped trusting our divine protector. Yet even after we pushed him away, heaven still offered us a final lifeline. Samuel stood before us, his voice shaking the dust. Here is the king you begged for. The Lord has crowned him." Then the old prophet laid out the heavy, fragile rules of our shiny new monarchy. His warning chilled me. If you fear the Lord, serve him, and refuse to rebel against his sacred commands. And if both you and your new earthly king follow the Almighty, you survive. But if you turn away, if you dare break the sacred covenant, his hand will crush you just like your father's. My stomach dropped. A crown wouldn't save us. Our survival still rested completely on surrendering to the unseen God. This man on the throne could never replace heaven. He was just a fragile human leader who desperately needed to bow down himself. To burn this truth into our wandering minds, Samuel did something terrifying. He commanded the crowd, "Stand still. Watch the overwhelming power heaven is about to unleash before your very eyes." "It is the dry harvest," he cried out. "I will summon thunder and rain. Then you will finally feel the wicked, awful weight of demanding a human king instead of our God." He prayed, and the sky instantly broke open. Thunder rattled my bones. Cold rain soaked the massive crowd, and we froze in absolute terror of the Almighty and his prophet. Storms during the dry harvest ruined crops. It was a violent, undeniable flash of divine power, proving beyond doubt that the Creator spoke directly through this old man. I shook with fear, begging Samuel for mercy. We loudly confessed our dark betrayal, but the wise prophet refused to let us drown in our own miserable shame. He softened his voice to comfort us. "Do not be afraid. Yes, you have committed deep evil, but stop running. Stay and serve the Maker with your whole fractured heart." He reminded us of an ancient, unbroken promise. The divine name carries weight. The Creator will not abandon you, he declared, simply because he chose you to be his. Samuel finished his speech with a heavy, haunting vow. "As for me," he promised the weeping crowd, "I would be sinning against heaven if I ever stopped praying for your wandering souls. I will keep teaching you the true and righteous path." He was stepping down from his earthly seat, but Samuel would forever remain the fierce divine prophet anchoring us to heaven with endless prayers. Then came the final, chilling warning, "But you must fiercely hold on to your faith. Fear the Creator and serve him wholly. Remember the miracles he gave you, because if you keep choosing the dark, both you and your precious new king will die." And just like that, the old judge stepped back. An ancient era violently closed. Now the terrifying question hung in the air: how would Saul guide our broken souls next? Let's step into this dark unknown together. Saul wore the crown, but to my deeply anxious eyes, he hadn't yet proven he could actually bleed on the battlefield. The bloody test came fast. Nahash, a ruthless Ammonite warlord, surrounded our vulnerable brothers in Jabesh Gilead. The incoming reports of his absolute cruelty made my blood run completely cold. The monstrous enemy camped right at their gates. Driven by pure, paralyzing terror, our trapped men begged Nahash, "Give us a treaty. We will surrender and become your loyal slaves." The warlord smiled a truly sick smile. "I will spare you," he sneered. "Only if I carve out every man's right eye. I want to leave a permanent bleeding scar on all Israel." The demand made me sick. Nahash didn't just want to conquer the city. He wanted to mutilate our identity and humiliate our entire fractured nation. Trembling, the trapped elders begged for 7 days to find a savior. If no rescuer answered the call, they would willingly offer their faces to Nahash's blade. When the bleeding runners stumbled into our town with the news, my knees gave out. The entire street wailed in the dust, crushed by absolute, overwhelming despair. Saul walked in from the fields, dirt on his hands. "Why is everyone crying?" he asked. When we told him about the horrifying threat, I saw a terrifying, divine shadow shift inside him. As those desperate words hit him, I watched a sudden, violently holy energy rush right into his chest. His eyes burned with intense, righteous rage. Gripped by this unseen spiritual force, Saul didn't hesitate for a second. He violently grabbed a pair of oxen to send an unforgettable wake-up call. He hacked the animals apart. Runners scattered the bloody chunks across the land with a grim warning: "March with Saul and Samuel, or your herds will look exactly like this." A heavy supernatural dread washed over my soul. The scattered tribes suddenly locked arms, driven by a deep divine terror. It was a dark, bloody summons nobody dared to ignore. The grim ultimatum was deafening: hide from the king's battle and lose everything. The sheer, massive response took my breath away. Hundreds of thousands of us marched into the gathering camp, forming a tense sea of anxious faces. Then Saul quickly fired a message back to the doomed men of Jabesh. "Before tomorrow's brutal afternoon heat, deliverance will strike." Reading those powerful words, our hopeless brothers wept with sudden, defiant joy. They turned to their twisted captors and lied. "We yield tomorrow," they promised. "Do whatever you want with us." It was a brilliant, desperate trick designed to feed the enemy's bloated, blind ego. By making the wicked warlord think his victims had totally given up, Saul easily tricked the hostile camp into a lazy, completely fatal arrogance. In the pitch black before dawn, my heart hammered as Saul split us into 3 columns. We silently crept into the sleeping enemy camp just as the sky finally turned gray. We completely shattered their silence. Breaking into their tents in those final dark hours, we unleashed absolute bloody carnage that lasted until the midday sun scorched our tired backs. The few survivors ran blindly into the desert, utterly alone. I stood breathless among the bodies. It was an absolutely crushing, unbelievable victory. The cruel monsters who wanted our eyes were gone, completely erased. Our brothers in Jabesh wept as we finally cut their ropes, saved from a life of permanent, dark mutilation. Staring at the drying blood on Saul's sword, everything shifted for me. He wasn't just some farmer with oil on his head anymore. He was a terrifying, proven warrior. Pure adrenaline surged through the ranks. Angry men started shouting, "Who doubted our king? Drag those treasonous cowards out here right now so we can end their lives." The furious crowd demanded blood from the early skeptics who once mocked Saul's farm roots. The thrill of our survival was quickly twisting into an ugly mob seeking revenge. But our new king held up his heavy hand. "No one dies today," he calmly commanded. "Heaven delivered us, not human rage." It was a sudden, profound display of deep mercy. He could have become a petty tyrant right there. But what about you and I? Are we still searching for a leader who chooses divine grace over the bloody blade? I knew the victory belonged to God alone, not my own hands. My heart felt clear then. Samuel saw this newfound maturity in me and seized the moment to cement my throne. He called out to the crowds, "Come, let us go to Gilgal and renew the kingship." My people followed, marching to Gilgal, confirming me as their king before the Lord. The ancient texts record it. There at Gilgal, they crowned me king in the presence of the Almighty, offering blood and smoke to heaven. My people and I threw ourselves into a massive celebration. It was a holy, joyous ceremony, thick with the scent of burnt offerings. My crown was finally secure, anointed in secret by Samuel, publicly chosen at Mizpah, and now confirmed at Gilgal following a triumphant, bloody victory. Nobody doubted my authority or my strength to lead them into war. I began so perfectly. Surging with God's Spirit, I found the courage to face any dark threat. I planned the battles wisely and forgave those who doubted me. Israel had every reason to celebrate the man I had become. Yet beneath that golden beginning, a terrifying rot grew inside me. It wouldn't take long for the deep cracks in my soul to surface. The ancient records say I was 30 when I took the throne, ruling Israel for 42 long years. I was in my prime. The entire world lay before me. Early on, I forged an army of 3,000 warriors. 2,000 stayed by my side in Michmash and Bethel's hills. 1,000 stood with my son Jonathan in Jibah. I sent the rest home to their families. But Jonathan, filled with my early fire, struck and shattered a Philistine outpost at Jebah. A glorious victory, yes, but the fallout was utterly catastrophic. Soon enough, the terrifying news washed over all of Israel. I had provoked the beast, and my name became a curse among the Philistines. Boiling with rage, they amassed a colossal, nightmarish army to completely crush us. 3,000 chariots, 6,000 drivers. Their soldiers swarmed the horizon, endless and thick as sand on the seashore, coming for my crown. They marched up and camped at Michmash, east of Beit Aven. A horrifying sight. Panic gripped my people as the grim reality set in. Seeing our desperate reality and feeling the crushing pressure, my warriors completely broke. They scattered, crawling into dark caves, shivering in thickets, hiding deep within rocks, pits, and dry cisterns. Some of my own people even fled across the Jordan, escaping into Gad and Gilead. Pure terror paralyzed the camp. My men were deserting, disappearing into the shadows. The few who stayed beside me were shaking uncontrollably, and there I was, waiting at Gilgal for Samuel. I waited 7 agonizing days, exactly as Samuel instructed. But the prophet never showed up at Gilgal, and my remaining soldiers started bleeding away. The anxiety was suffocating. The Philistines were primed to strike, my troops were vanishing, and Samuel, the man meant to offer sacrifices and bring divine guidance, was nowhere to be found. So, I made a fatal choice. Desperate, I shouted, "Bring me the burnt offering and the fellowship offerings." I sacrificed the animal myself, but lighting that altar was a sacred duty only priests could perform. I was a king, not a priest. I had crossed a terrifying line, stepping into a sacred space that was never mine. The smoke had barely risen when Samuel finally arrived. Cornered and ashamed, I tried defending my sin. "I saw my army slipping away," I pleaded. "You didn't arrive on time, and the Philistines were gathering like vultures at Michmash." I was terrified. I thought they would slaughter me at Gilgal before I even asked for God's favor. I felt forced to act. I threw out 3 desperate excuses for my rebellion. My soldiers were abandoning me. Samuel was late. The enemy was closing in. The crushing pressure demanded absolute control, so I took it. It felt so completely rational in my mind. But I ignored the brutal truth. God's commands cannot be broken, no matter how terrifying the silence gets. Samuel's stare cut right through me. "You have done a profoundly foolish thing," he snapped. "You abandoned the strict command of your God. Had you obeyed, he would have anchored your throne over Israel forever." Then came the curse that shattered my soul. But now it ends. "The Lord has already found a man after his own heart. He will rule this nation, all because you threw away God's command." Those crushing words hollowed out my chest. My legacy was dead. The Almighty had already handpicked a better man to wear my crown and take my place. All erased by one terrified choice. To anyone else, it might look like a cruel punishment for a leader just trying to survive. But the divine sees our deepest rot. My failure proved who I really was. Crushed by pressure, I trusted my own ego over God's voice. I chose my own illusion of control instead of enduring God's painful silence. After that deeply shattering confrontation, Samuel abandoned me, heading to Gibeah. I counted the wretched souls still standing by my side, only 600 men, a pathetic ghost town against the Philistine machine. And sadly, that wouldn't be the last time I let my fear dictate my actions. Even after the crushing weight of that divine rejection at Gilgal, heaven offered me one final, fragile chance at redemption. The ancient texts say Samuel came to me again. "I anointed you king over Israel," he warned. "Listen closely to the Lord's voice now." He handed down a chilling, inescapable mission straight from God: march out and completely annihilate the Amalekites, a tribe that ambushed my ancestors as they fled Egypt long ago. The mandate was completely uncompromising. Strike Amalek down, destroy absolutely everything they own. Leave 0 survivors behind. Erase their men and women, the infants, the herds of cattle, sheep, camels, and donkeys. It was a brutal, terrifying burden, but perfectly clear. That entire nation and their wealth had to become dust. I was to spare absolutely nothing. I rallied my forces, 200,000 Israelites and 10,000 from Judah. Closing in on the Amalekite stronghold, I warned the Kenites to run for their lives. They were the bloodline of Moses' father-in-law, a people who once showed us deep kindness. I slaughtered the Amalekites, laying waste from Havilah all the way to Shur, right near the Egyptian border. But here is my fatal flaw. I read verse 9 and step into the ancient text. I am Saul. My army and I spared Agag, the finest sheep, the fattest calves. We just couldn't bring ourselves to destroy what looked so valuable. But anything weak or worthless, I wiped it out completely. It was a direct, calculated rebellion against what God commanded me. I was ordered to leave absolutely nothing breathing. Instead, I made the choice to keep King Agag and the finest animals alive. I thought Agag was a brilliant trophy of my power. Destroying those prime animals felt like an utter waste of wealth. But heaven saw my pride, and God's judgment fell immediately. Verse 10 shatters me. The Lord whispers to Samuel, "I regret making Saul king. He has turned his back on me and abandoned my instructions." My identity was suddenly slipping away. Samuel burned with anger, crying out in the dark until dawn. He was entirely heartbroken. He was the one who poured the oil on my head. And now I had failed him again. He spent the entire night agonizing before God, begging for my soul, desperately gathering the courage to finally confront me. He knew the collision was unavoidable. At sunrise, Samuel tracked me down. I met him wearing a mask of absolute confidence, shouting, "The Lord bless you." "I have carried out the Lord's instructions." The self-deception was staggering. I genuinely convinced myself I was faithful despite hiding Agag and the livestock, but Samuel saw right through me. In verse 14, his voice cuts through the air. "Then what is this bleating of sheep in my ears? What is this cattle I hear?" My panicked reply exposed my crumbling mind. "The soldiers brought them from the Amalekites," I lied. "They kept the best sheep and cattle to sacrifice to the Lord your God. But we completely destroyed the rest. You and I know this move." I dodged the blame, pointing fingers at my own men as if I wasn't the king. I twisted my dark rebellion to look like holy devotion, a glorious sacrifice to heaven. But God never wanted a religious performance. He demanded my total surrender. Samuel violently cuts me off. "Stop! Let me tell you what the Lord declared in the night." I braced myself as he unleashed a question that pierced my soul. "Even though you once saw yourself as nothing, didn't you become the head of Israel's tribes? The Lord himself anointed you as king. And he sent you on a sacred mission, saying, 'Go and completely destroy those wicked Amalekites. Wage war until every last one is wiped out.' Why did you ignore the Lord? Why did you violently pounce on the plunder and do evil in his sight?" That accusation struck the very core of my identity. I had entirely forgotten my fragile beginnings. I used to be a nobody, a frightened boy hiding among the baggage from the smallest tribe in all of Israel. But with a crown on my head, I arrogantly thought I could rewrite God's rules to fit my desires. In verse 20, I desperately defended myself, but I did obey. I finished the mission, I brought back King Agag in chains, and I slaughtered the rest. I doubled down again in verse 21. It was the soldiers. They took the prime sheep and cattle from the plunder to offer a massive sacrifice to the Lord your God down at Gilgal. Once again, I pushed the guilt onto my troops, dressing up my cowardice as holy worship. But Samuel didn't flinch. His response still haunts me across the centuries. Does God actually want your religious burnt offerings, or does he want your obedience? To obey is infinitely better than sacrifice. To listen is better than the fat of rams. Because your rebellion is just as dark as witchcraft, and your arrogant pride is no different than bowing to idols. Because you rejected the Lord's word, he has rejected you as king. The words crushed me. The Almighty doesn't care about our empty religious rituals. Without a submissive heart, my rebellion was witchcraft. My ego was a false god. I traded the truth for a lie, and in that moment I lost my kingdom forever. Finally, trembling in verse 24, I cracked. "I have sinned. I broke the Lord's command and ignored every single one of your instructions. I was terrified of my own men, so I caved to their demands. But my apology was hollow. Seconds later, I was begging Samuel to make me look good in front of the elders. I was still completely obsessed with my public image, totally blind to my shattered soul. Samuel delivered the death blow in verse 28. "The Lord has violently torn the kingdom from you today, giving it to someone better." He stared right through me. "The glory of Israel does not lie or change his mind. He is not a mortal man who second-guesses himself." The verdict was entirely final. The Spirit of God was leaving me, making room for a stranger to take my throne. From that terrifying day forward, Samuel walked away and never looked at my face again. He grieved for me deeply in the shadows, but I was dead to him. It was a catastrophic end to what should have been a beautiful legacy. I was the chosen one, the first anointed king, ruined by my own terrifying need for control. My panic at Gilgal fractured my reign, but keeping those Amalekite spoils hammered the final nail. Now the Creator was hunting for a man with a truly pure heart. You and I must look at my ruin and learn. Heaven demands surrender above all else. It doesn't matter how spectacular our religious performance looks on the outside. Without true obedience, everything we do is empty smoke. As Samuel burned into my memory, to obey is better than sacrifice. He was still out there weeping over my failure. Despite the dark path I chose, the old prophet desperately prayed I would turn around. But eventually, God interrupted him. "How long will you mourn for Saul? I am done with him. Fill your horn with oil and get moving. I am sending you to Jesse in Bethlehem. I have chosen a new king from among his sons to replace this broken man." Heaven was turning the page. Even while Samuel clung to the ghost of my potential, destiny was marching forward to find my replacement in the hills of Judea. They needed someone whose soul beat in rhythm with the Creator. That boy was waiting in Bethlehem among Jesse's sons, but the mission came with a deadly, terrifying catch. The prophet was paralyzed by fear of what I had become. "If Saul hears about this, he will execute me," he told God. So the Lord gave him a cover story: "Take a heifer, tell them you came to sacrifice. Invite Jesse to the altar, and I will reveal your next move. Anoint the one I point to." It was an impossibly dangerous assignment, a stealth mission against my throne. Samuel was revered, a holy man of God, but I was a paranoid king slipping into madness. I held the brutal power to execute anyone who dared threaten my crown. If I discovered my own mentor was pouring sacred oil on a rival while I still gripped the scepter, I would have viewed it as treason, a guaranteed death sentence. So they used a half-truth to bypass my wrath. Samuel went to Bethlehem for a legitimate sacrifice, keeping the real, earth-shattering motive hidden in the shadows, crowning my successor. Ever wonder why God lets us hide our deepest fears? Samuel didn't tell the whole truth that day, concealing his real motive just to survive the journey. He walked into my small town, Bethlehem, carrying a heavy secret, but his arrival triggered absolute chaos. The ancient scrolls simply say he obeyed the voice. Our town elders shook with terror when they saw him. "Do you come in peace?" they begged. Why would grown men tremble at a single prophet's shadow? Because sudden spiritual visitors usually brought a curse, a brutal exposure of secret sins, or impending ruin. Or maybe the toxic warfare between Samuel and the mad King Saul made them fear becoming collateral damage in a royal bloodbath, but Samuel calmed their racing hearts. "I come in peace to offer sacrifice," he swore. "Purify yourselves and join me." He turned to my father, Jesse, cleansing him and my brothers, inviting them into the holy circle. This ritual meant washing away the dirt, changing garments, and denying their fleshly desires. A psychological stripping down to face the divine. It was the ancient way to prepare. His arrival sent a shockwave of whispers through our quiet streets. Prophets didn't wander our way often. Everyone was asking why he chose our forgotten soil for this ritual, and why my father and my strong brothers were singled out. Nobody saw the shadow of destiny hanging over us. The secret belonged only to the prophet and the Creator. The stage was quietly set to alter my people's identity forever. The crowning of a new ruler, one pulled from obscurity, chosen not for his armor or muscle, but for his beating heart. As the smoke rose, the prophet surveyed my family. His desperate gaze locked onto my oldest brother, Eliab, seeing exactly what he wanted to see. Eliab was towering, built like the very king who was currently destroying us. Deep down, Samuel thought this has to be the chosen one. But then a voice broke through. The divine whispered a truth that shatters how we all seek validation today. Ignore his height, his perfect face. I have totally rejected him. I do not see the hollow masks humanity worships. Man stares at the surface, but I search the abyss of the soul. It is a terrifying thought. The Creator pierces through our modern illusions. He doesn't care about your resume, your strength, or your curated image. He digs into the dark soil of your psyche, your secret fears, hidden desires, and rawest motives. One after another, my brothers marched into the light. Abinadab, then Shammah, strong men paraded like prime sacrifices. 7 brothers stood tall, yet the invisible voice remained silent. Not them. Stripped of his assumptions, the bewildered prophet finally asked, "Are these all the boys you have?" My father muttered, "There is the youngest, but he is out with the sheep." I find it agonizingly funny that my own blood forgot I existed when Grace came to town. Maybe I was too small to matter, or maybe the flock just needed a babysitter. Whatever the excuse was. I was the outcast left in the wilderness, yet I was the target of heaven. "Fetch him," Samuel ordered. "We do not sit until he breathes this room's air." So they finally called my name. I walked in smelling of dirt and isolation. The text claims I was glowing, a kid with bright eyes and a rugged sort of grace. Then the silence shattered. "Rise and anoint him. He is the one." Suddenly, the oil was dripping down my face. I stood there, trembling, while my brothers glared in absolute disbelief. What happened next broke reality. From that exact second, a heavy, ancient presence fused with my soul. I wasn't just a shepherd anymore, it was profoundly terrifying. A lonely kid, the afterthought of the family, suddenly branded with the horrific weight of a crown. And the spirit didn't just visit, it crushed into my bones, rewiring me for the brutal path ahead. My brothers stood paralyzed with envy. I could see them thinking, why him? We are the seasoned warriors, why pick the runt? But divinity doesn't care about our social hierarchies. He found a mirror in my shattered, searching heart. Samuel vanished back to Ramah, leaving his dangerous secret buried in our home. A rival king was born in the shadows, just as ordained. Now I was left to sit in the tension of a prophecy, waiting for my perilous future to begin. What do you do after touching God? I went back to the dirt, outwardly just a shepherd, but inside my mind a massive psychological earthquake had hit. An ancient power burned within me, forging me for the throne. You and I know this feeling, how destiny always hunts down the broken, the exiled, the painfully small. The one society labels completely useless to carry out the ultimate work. A later saint said it best, the weak are chosen specifically to humiliate the arrogant and strong. But while the light flooded into me, a profound darkness was swallowing King Saul alive. The old records capture his descent. The divine presence abandoned Saul, leaving a horrific, suffocating void that an evil spirit rushed to fill. A terrifying dual reality. My mind waking up, his mind fracturing completely. The mantle of identity was violently ripped from his shoulders and placed on mine. And in that hollow, empty space of his soul, paranoia and demonic terror began to fester. The royal court watched their king lose his mind. He became manic, sleepless, dangerous. Desperate, his servants finally told him, look, a dark terror is eating you alive from inside. So they pitched a psychological remedy. Let us find a musician, they pleaded, someone who can strike the strings of a lyre to anchor your unraveling thoughts. Music might drown out the darkness when the panic attacks hit. Barely holding onto his fleeting sanity, Saul commanded, find me someone who plays perfectly. And a guard remembered a boy in Bethlehem. I have seen Jesse's kid from Bethlehem, a guard offered. He plays beautifully, but he is also brave, speaks with quiet wisdom, looks sharp, and there is a heavy divine presence covering him. That last detail sealed my fate. It is deeply unsettling how this grand design operates. The madman crying out for psychological relief was actively hunting the very kid anointed to ruin him. I was being pulled straight into the viper's nest. The royal guard showed up at my father's door, demanding, send me David, the boy who hides with the sheep. Terrified of refusing, my father packed up a political bribe, a donkey hauling fresh bread, a skin of wine, and a slaughtered goat, and shoved me toward the tyrant. When I walked into that manic throne room, Saul latched onto me immediately. I was officially trapped in the terrifying orbit of the king. He loved me instantly, forcing me to carry his bloody weapons. He had absolutely zero clue that the ghost holding his armor was already wearing his spiritual crown. The king sent word, David stays, he pleases me. So there I sat in the darkness, a boy trapped with a monster. I plucked the harp strings every single time the crushing paranoia gripped him, fighting demons with melodies. So what do you and I learn? Whenever the darkness swallowed Saul, I played. We all face our monsters, armed with nothing but a fragile, stubborn song. I watched the heavy darkness lift from King Saul. My fingers plucked the strings, and the terrifying shadows retreated. My music became his only medicine. The gentle melody chased away the torment gripping his mind. I poured my soul into that harp, trying to heal a broken king. I had no idea I was sitting on the very throne I would one day inherit. You and I both know how God uses our hidden gifts to unlock unimaginable doors, sometimes pulling us straight from the wilderness and dropping us into royal palaces. Just like that, my new identity was set. I was the king's musician and his armor-bearer. But the crushing weight of my true test was coming. The Philistines, our ancient tormentors, were gathering like a storm for absolute war. They amassed their brutal forces in Judah, pitching a massive, terrifying camp between the hills. The sheer scale of their army choked the horizon. We Israelites scrambled together, setting up our camp in the Valley of Allah. Two massive armies stared each other down from opposite ridges, a deep, silent valley dividing us. Then a walking nightmare stepped out from the enemy lines. I can still see him clearly. A monstrous champion named Goliath of Gath strode out, casting a freezing dread. Standing over 9 feet tall, he wasn't just a giant in flesh, but in iron. His bronze helmet gleamed, and his massive scale armor weighed a crushing 125 pounds. Thick bronze strapped his legs. The iron tip of his massive spear alone weighed 15 pounds. He was a walking slaughterhouse built to paralyze us with sheer terror. For 40 agonizing days, that monster stepped out to mock our paralyzed army. His voice boomed through the valley. Why even bother lining up to fight me? Am I not a Philistine master and you just pathetic slaves of King Saul? Pick your best man. Send him down into the dirt. If he actually kills me, we surrender completely. But when I crush him and rip his life away, you all become our slaves. It was a brutal demand for single combat, the ancient way of settling wars. One bloody fight to the death to decide everything. But who among us had the nerve to step up to a literal mountain of muscle and rage? When those words echoed, our entire camp froze. I watched King Saul and every last soldier totally shatter in utter, helpless terror. Even the king, the man supposed to protect us, trembled in his tent. For 40 endless days, we suffocated under a heavy, crushing blanket of cowardice. That's when I walked right into the nightmare. I wasn't a hero. I was just a quiet shepherd from Bethlehem, clinging to an identity I was about to lose. My 3 oldest brothers were trapped in that miserable camp. My father had sent me down there carrying bread and roasted grain, just hoping to see if they were alive. I remember waking up before dawn. I left the sheep with another keeper, packed up the heavy supplies, and marched toward the valley, doing exactly as told. I hit the camp boundary just as our troops were screaming a hollow, desperate war cry. Dumping my bags with the supply guard, I bolted straight to the front lines to find my brothers. While we spoke, the giant stomped out, spitting his usual poison. I watched grown men, my own people, scatter like frightened mice. I was completely stunned. I grabbed a soldier and demanded, "Who is this uncircumcised monster, thinking he can mock the armies of the living God?" To me, this wasn't just a military threat. This was a direct attack on heaven. But my oldest brother, Eliab, heard me and his face twisted with rage. He cornered me, spitting venom. "Why are you even here? Who's watching those pathetic sheep in the dirt? I know your arrogance. I know the dark wickedness rotting in your chest. You just came down to watch the bloodshed." His words cut deep, dripping with bitter jealousy. Maybe he was still haunted by the day the prophet chose me instead. I refused to let his bitterness break me. What have I even done now? Can I not even ask a question? I turned away, continuing to press about the giant. Word reached King Saul that someone was finally asking questions. He dragged me into his tent, staring in shock at his own harp player. I looked the trembling king in the eye. "Let no man's heart fail because of this beast. I will go and fight him." Saul just stared, entirely baffled by my reckless, impossible courage. He shook his head. "You cannot survive this fight. You are nothing but a boy, and that monster has been slaughtering men since he was a child." But I held secrets of survival he knew nothing about. I leaned in close. "I have spent years guarding my father's flock in the brutal wilderness. When a starving lion or a massive bear dragged off one of my lambs, I hunted it down. I cracked its jaw open and pulled the bleeding sheep free. When the beast spun around to tear my throat out, I grabbed it by the mane and crushed its skull. I have buried both the lion and the bear. This arrogant warlord will end up rotting just like them, because he dared to mock the living God. The same unseen hand that pulled me from the bloody claws of the lion and the bear will rip me from this giant's grip." I wasn't trusting my own fragile muscles. I was leaning entirely on the supreme power that had shielded me time and time again. In my mind, Goliath was just another wild animal blocking the path. He had spit in the face of the divine. And someone had to make him choke on it. Seeing my burning conviction, Saul finally surrendered. "Go, may heaven protect you." The king strapped his own heavy, awkward metal onto my chest. I took 2 steps and stopped. "I cannot fight in this foreign shell. It isn't who I am." I threw the armor off. Gripping my worn staff, I plucked 5 smooth stones from the creek, dropped them in my pouch, and walked toward the monster. He saw me and erupted in fury. He screamed down at me, "Am I some street dog that you chase me with sticks?" He cursed my bloodline by his dark gods, but I planted my feet in the dirt and stared back. "You march at me with a heavy sword, spear, and javelin," I yelled. "But I come at you in the name of the Almighty, the exact God you just insulted." I let my voice carry across the dead silence. "Today, heaven hands you over to me. I will strike you straight down and take your head. I will feed your rotting army to the waiting vultures. You and I must confront this truth. Sometimes we have to stand alone so the whole world remembers who holds the real power. Everyone shivering in this valley will realize salvation doesn't come from sharp iron or heavy shields. The fight belongs entirely to the unseen, and he is handing you to us." As the massive brute lunged forward to crush me, I didn't back away. I sprinted straight at him. I reached into my bag, pulled a single stone, and let the sling fly. It cracked into his skull like thunder. The giant's eyes rolled back, and he crashed face first into the dust. You and I probably both know what it's like to face a monster empty-handed. I brought down the Philistine giant with just a sling and one smooth stone. I rushed over, staring down at the massive body. Trembling, I dragged Goliath's own heavy sword from its sheath and took his head. My impossible survival was absolute. Seeing their invincible champion dead, the Philistine army broke and ran. My people, suddenly ignited by my faith, chased them down and destroyed them. That brutal victory dragged my life into chaos. In mere hours, I changed from a forgotten shepherd into an overnight national hero. All because I trusted God and faced a nightmare I couldn't comprehend. That single, impossible victory over Goliath forced me onto a dangerous pedestal. Marching home from the battlefield, the reality shifted. As we returned from slaughtering the Philistine, an ancient text records an absolute shift in my destiny. Women poured from every Israelite town to greet King Saul. They danced, playing tambourines and stringed instruments. It was a massive, dizzying celebration of our unbelievable military success. But their innocent lyrics ignited a venomous, psychological fire inside the king's heart. They joyfully sang, "Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands." I felt the atmosphere freeze. Saul was the chosen monarch. Those words poisoned his very soul. Suddenly, the naive harpist he hired was stealing his glory. I could see his identity shattering before my eyes. The king became violently furious. That song deeply sickened him. He whispered in the shadows, "They give this boy tens of thousands, but leave me with only thousands." What is left to give him except the crown itself? Saul saw my combat success and the people's adoration as a direct, terrifying threat to his fragile power. And then came the true nightmare. From that moment, Saul watched me with pure paranoia. You and I know how jealousy rots the soul. For the king, it mutated into a deadly obsession. He kept a manic eye on me. The very next morning, the spiritual atmosphere collapsed. A dark, tormenting spirit crushed Saul's mind, twisting his thoughts into total madness. He was raving inside his palace while I sat there, quietly playing my harp just as always. He gripped a heavy spear tightly. My music was meant to bring him healing. Instead, as I played to soothe his broken mind, the king silently plotted my brutal murder. Without warning, Saul hurled the weapon straight at me. He wanted to pin my body to the stone wall. Trembling, I somehow dodged his deadly strike twice. I narrowly escaped the room. Blinded by frantic rage, Saul tried to butcher me right in front of witnesses. He didn't even care who saw. But my quick reflexes saved my life. Missing his target only deepened his spiraling paranoia. The ancient record confirms. Saul was completely terrified of me. He realized the divine presence had left him to stand beside me instead. His ultimate nightmare of losing everything was coming true. Desperate to remove me from his sight, he exiled me to the battlefield. He placed me in command of 1,000 Israelite warriors. I marched out, leading those troops into heavy combat, but his scheme totally backfired. Facing death only cemented my identity and made the people love me more. Every mission I commanded ended in overwhelming success, driven by divine grace. The whole nation of Israel poured their hearts out to me as their victorious leader. Seeing my influence rise in the wilderness, he changed his strategy. He offered his daughter Michal to me in marriage, but demanded a suicidal price. Saul told his messengers, "The king wants no wealth for the bride. Just bring me 100 Philistine trophies as bloody vengeance against our enemies." The sacred text reveals his true, chilling motive. He wanted the Philistines to butcher me. He prayed I would die a violent death in the dirt, but again I shattered his expectations. My men and I rode out, slaughtering 200 Philistines. I dumped the horrific payment right at his feet to claim my royal bride. Cornered by his own twisted rules, he was forced to surrender Michal. Instead of bringing him 100, I brought 200. I didn't just survive, I dominated his trap. The king's dread of me grew into a suffocating darkness. I became his lifelong obsession. The heavy, psychological tension between us stretched until it nearly snapped. I was just a young warrior caught in the middle, adored by crowds, carrying a spiritual favor I barely understood myself. And there was my king, suffocating under his own crown. Consumed by isolation, abandoned by heaven, and tormented by inner demons, we were locked on a fatal collision course. It forced me into an agonizing choice: stay loyal to a man actively hunting my blood, or abandon my entire life and run. His craving for my death became public. He openly commanded his own son Jonathan and every royal attendant to murder me on sight. But Jonathan loved me like a brother. What started as impulsive madness had crystallized into a cold, calculated political assassination. Saul completely underestimated the sacred bond Jonathan and I shared. Defying his father's insane royal decree, my closest friend secretly warned me to hide. He whispered urgently, "My father is hunting you down. Be on high alert by morning. Go deep into hiding and do not make a sound." Jonathan swore to confront the king, promising to bring me the truth. He stood up and fiercely defended my name, reminding his father how I risked my flesh against Goliath, bringing salvation to all of Israel. That bold defense struck a chord. Saul briefly woke from his madness, swearing on God's life I wouldn't be executed. Hearing this fragile promise, I cautiously returned to serve in his dangerous, shadowed halls. But peace is always fragile. When war called again, I crushed the Philistine lines. My bloody success instantly reignited the king's toxic, burning jealousy. That familiar dark spirit clawed its way back into Saul's mind. He sat alone in his bleak room, gripping that same hateful spear. As I played my harp, he lunged, trying to nail me to the cold wall. I slipped away just as the spear shattered the stone, sprinting blindly into the night. I never returned. The illusion of safety was dead. What do you and I do when the world turns against us? We run. I fled to my house, but the king's paranoia followed. You and I know the feeling of being utterly trapped. Assassins watched my door, waiting. Then my wife whispered a warning. "If you don't run tonight, tomorrow you die." She lowered me out a window into the dark. I vanished into the shadows, running for my life while she bought me time. She dragged a heavy household idol into our bed, burying the lifeless statue under my clothes. A tuft of goat's hair on the pillow made it look exactly like me. When the king's executioners pounded on the door, she claimed I was sick. But Saul's hatred was absolute. "Drag him here in his bed. I'll slaughter him myself." They stormed in only to find a cold, wooden dummy in my place. The king's wrath turned on his own blood. "Why did you betray me?" he demanded. "Why let my enemy survive?" Terrified of her father's towering rage, she lied to save us both. "He forced me," she claimed. "He swore he would kill me if I didn't help." Out in the wilderness, my identity was crumbling. I ran to Ramah, desperate for the old prophet, Samuel. I poured out my absolute terror to him, confessing every manic attempt the king had made on my life. Samuel took me to Nith to hide. It was a pivotal turning point for my soul. In my darkest, most terrifying hour, I clung to the very man who once anointed me. Samuel wasn't just a guide. He was the only tie I had left to a forgotten promise for my life. Hidden away in that quiet prophetic sanctuary, I found a fleeting moment of peace. But the king's spies were everywhere. The inevitable whisper reached the palace. I was there in Naioth. The king dispatched his hunters to drag me back. But then the inexplicable occurred, as the armed men marched into our circle of worship. The spirit of the divine crashed into them. Their weapons dropped and they began to prophesy. 2 more death squads came, only to be swallowed by that same overpowering presence. Furious, the king himself marched on Ramah. Tracking our every step past Siku, the tyrant closed in on Nith, hunting me down personally. Yet as he breached the limits of Na, Something completely mind-bending took place before my eyes. The divine presence struck the king. He marched forward, entranced, tearing off his royal robes. Stripped of his worldly armor, my tormentor collapsed in the dirt before us, lying completely naked in a trance for an entire day and night. It birthed a proverb, "Is Saul also among the prophets?" A haunting echo of a question first asked years ago when he was a different man. Back then, fresh from his anointing, the Spirit had lifted him up. Watching him now, it felt like the divine was forcibly stripping him down. A brutal reminder of who he was before paranoia rotted his soul. While he lay immobilized, I seized my chance and ran into the unknown. Fleeing into the shadows, I desperately sought out my friend Jonathan. We had to know the truth. We devised a dangerous test to see if his father's bloodlust was truly permanent and unyielding. When the mad king threw a spear at his own son just for defending me, the truth hit hard. Jonathan told me to run. My years of agonizing exile had begun. Starving and terrified, I reached Nob. Amalek the priest handed me holy bread and Goliath's sword. I fled to enemy territory, acting completely insane just to survive the streets. Stick with me here because exile changes a man. I vanished into a dark cave, entirely alone until the broken found me. Every outcast, bankrupt debtor, and bitter soul in the land bled into my cave. I became a general of ruins, leading 400 desperate men. I smuggled my parents into Moab for their safety. Then I vanished back into Judah, hiding deep within the dark forest of Herth. When the king realized Nob's priests had fed me, his madness slaughtered 85 innocent men and wiped out the town. His manhunt pushed me deeper into the wasteland, jumping between shadows. Twice I had the perfect shot to end his life. Twice I lowered my blade, refusing to destroy the man heaven had once chosen. And in all these lonely years of wandering, Samuel vanished from my life entirely. The aging seer faded from the story, his physical work done. Yet his imprint on my soul carried me through the darkest nights. That terrifying sprint to Ramah wasn't just survival, it was the anchor of my sanity. I had lost everything. The royal court, my marriage, my absolute deepest friendship with Jonathan. My rank as a commander was gone. I was just a hunted man, pouring out his trauma to a quiet prophet in the dead of night. The old seer knew this fiery trial was the crucible meant to forge my chaotic heart. But knowing it was divine didn't stop him from shielding a terrified boy. I look back now and see how desperate I was. Stripped of my strength, I escaped to Ramah, emptying every ounce of my crushing anxiety at Samuel's feet. He brought me to Naioth. It wasn't a military fortress, it was a secluded school where young prophets sought after heaven. It was a space of pure faith. Men gathered there to study the unseen world, immersing themselves in ancient texts to build a genuine connection with the Maker. Pulling me into Naioth, Samuel dragged me out of my war trauma and into a place thick with spiritual gravity. I didn't just find a physical wall to hide behind. I found an anchor for my identity, washing away the toxic paranoia that had poisoned my mind at the palace. Yet peace is always fragile. When my tormentor finally learned where I was hiding, he unleashed his hounds to drag me back. But then, the unbelievable happened. As the king's executioners closed in, they were met by a wave of worship. Samuel stood firm, leading his students in a massive prophetic chant. Then the divine current grabbed them. Picture this, brutal, battle-hardened soldiers marching in to kill, suddenly collapsing under a holy weight, weeping and chanting with us. Heaven itself stepped in to guard my life. Enraged by the failure, the tyrant sent a second wave of killers. They broke the exact same way. He ordered a third strike. Once again, they fell under that massive, invisible force. Driven completely mad, the king marched on Ramah himself. Spitting demands for my location, he tore through the roads, coming straight for my throat at Nith. But then the unthinkable hit him. The same divine presence crashed onto his shoulders. He walked in a complete trance, prophesying every step to our sanctuary. He tore his royal armor off his own back, completely stripped of his power. My greatest enemy collapsed in the dirt before Samuel, lying utterly defenseless for 24 hours. It birthed a legend. Is Saul also among the prophets? What do you and I make of this today? A tyrant who came to kill me, suddenly paralyzed and stripped naked by divine grace. I watched the king, stripped of his royal robes, trapped in a trance all day and night. No wonder the crowd whispered that mocking question, "Is Saul now a prophet?" This wasn't the first time those words haunted him. Years ago, right after Samuel first anointed him, God's Spirit had seized him, making him prophesy, and the people asked that same question. But now, years later, I stood shivering in the shadows. Everything had changed. Back then, it proved God was equipping him to lead. Now, it was a divine roadblock, a desperate, mysterious way to paralyze the king and keep me alive. Samuel, leading the prophets, watched it all unfold. He saw how heaven itself was shielding me, the terrified, lonely man he had anointed to take the throne. Maybe he felt a crushing sorrow, seeing how far the king had fallen. For me, this bizarre moment proved I wasn't abandoned. Even with the king bringing the entire army to hunt me down, God would bend reality itself to keep me breathing. The ancient text holds secrets. Hiding there in Naioth, trembling under Samuel's roof, I likely poured my terror and my fractured identity into my earliest psalms. So many of those songs cry out for rescue in the darkest, most lonely times. And this strange sanctuary in Naioth anchored my soul. It was the final time I ever saw Samuel, one of his very last acts of ministry. The weary prophet who had poured oil on both my enemy and me was finished. His heavy, holy burden was lifting. Rest was finally coming. The ancient scroll delivers a crushing blow. Chapter 25. Now Samuel died, and all of Israel gathered to mourn him. They buried my mentor at his home in Ramah. The man who carried the weight of heaven since childhood was gone. I felt my world collapse. He was the final judge, the ancient kind of guide we had relied on since Joshua's days. Yet he was also the spark for every great prophet to come. The sight of an entire kingdom stopping to weep proved just how deeply they revered the man who spoke for the divine. He was our anchor in the storm, a towering moral force leading us through the chaos of losing who we used to be. As a judge, he walked the dusty roads year after year, demanding truth. Unlike his own corrupt children, he never sold his soul or twisted the law. I remember his final speech, daring anyone to claim he had ever cheated or crushed them. The silence of the crowd was absolute. As a prophet, he was heaven's megaphone. Through him, God built the throne, tore it away from a madman, and gave it to me. His prophecies never failed. Every word came true because heaven backed him. As a priest, he served the altar from childhood under Eli. He bled the sacrifices, begged for our souls, and mapped out the holy path. Almost nobody else carried the crushing trifecta of judge, prophet, and priest. Maybe Moses alone understood that weight. Like him, my mentor dragged our people through a terrifying transition, moving from one era, the scattered judges, to the heavy crown, but he died before he could see me wear it. With him gone, I fled into the wasteland of Paran, a ghost running for my life. The king's obsession hunted me until that final battle against the Philistines, where Saul and my dear friend Jonathan would fall, finally clearing my path to the throne. But even without seeing his grand prophecies play out, the old prophet left this brutal world knowing he never compromised his calling. From the very first night, he whispered in the dark, "Speak, Lord. Your servant is listening." Right up to his final breath, he held the line. His shadow stretched far beyond the grave, the visionaries who followed. Nathan, Elijah, Isaiah, Jeremiah, they all walked in his footsteps, shouting fire and truth into the dark, even when staring down violent kings. You and I see this map clearly now. Centuries later, the book of Acts proved it. Peter stood up and declared, "Indeed." Beginning with Samuel, every prophet has pointed toward these days. He was the origin of a sacred line anticipating the ultimate savior. The letter to the Hebrews honors him too, etching his name beside Gideon, Samson, and yes, even me, as flawed men clinging to faith. But his heaviest mark was left right here on my soul. He found me, a dirty, forgotten shepherd boy, and poured the oil. Seeing me as heaven's choice, he gave me a place to hide when the paranoia of the king hunted me. He made me see that despite my terrifying exile, my shattered life still held purpose. You hear his guidance echoing through my psalms. Songs of desperate trust forged in the blackest nights. That gritty faith, hammered into me by Samuel, would define my entire reign. A rule remembered as a man chasing God's heart. When he stopped breathing, an entire chapter of our history slammed shut. Yet his quiet obedience kicked open the door to a brand new era. An age of fierce kings and radical prophets that would rewrite our spiritual DNA for 1,000 years. This giant, born from a desperate mother's tears, finished his grueling race. As the book of Hebrews puts it, these ancients were all praised for their faith. Yet they never saw the final promise. God held something better for us, so that only together with us their broken story becomes perfect. Listen, friend, you and I have walked through Samuel's life together, the final, greatest judge. We're standing at the edge of this ancient map now. We watched a boy born from raw grief grow into a titan carrying a nation on his back. We traced him from a lonely tabernacle floor, through that terrifying voice in the dark. His rise to power, the crushing shift to kings, straight to the bitter end where he shielded me, a terrified kid from a madman's rage. If this struggle through fear and finding real identity struck a nerve, pass it on. Share this with friends and family who need to. See how the divine transforms broken lives today. Hit subscribe. Stick with me as we unpack more of these ancient mysteries together. Every week, I embody these ancient scriptures, confronting my own terrifying isolation just to strengthen faith and understand the Word. Subscribe and stay with me in this lonely exile. Hit like, ring the bell. Your support helps share our fragile, flickering identity with the world. Thanks for bearing witness. May my journey through Samuel's lonely terror inspire your walk with God today.